1%. But that, of course, includes some activities undertaken by multinationals, which do not reflect the underlying growth of the Irish economy. If we focus instead on domestic dominated sectors of the Irish economy, labour productivity grew annually by 0.7% on average between 2011 and 2023. So it's from this perspective that today I want to discuss the productivity gap between the EU and the US. I'll start by discussing some of the proximate drivers of the growing productivity gap, namely lower investments to innovation and technological adoption, as well as lower business dynamism more broadly. I'll then dive into some of the structural drivers of these differences by focusing on some important differences between the US and EU product markets, financial markets, and labour markets. And I'll wrap up by discussing what implications this might have for the future. Let's start with a few facts. The first fact to highlight is that the main proximate driver of the slowdown in labour productivity in both the US and the EU is not a lack of investment in physical capital, nor changes in hours worked, but rather a decline in total factor productivity growth. Total factor productivity growth depends not on the accumulation of physical inputs over time, but rather on how productively these inputs are used. It therefore depends on innovation by incumbent firms, firm entry, and new product creation, and the extent to which inputs are efficiently allocated between firms. As with labour productivity, US TFP is well above that of EU economies, with a gap widening from around 13% in 1995 to around 20% in 2019. The second fact to highlight is that the US invests considerably more in research and development than the EU. In 1991, R&D spending was 2.5% of US GDP, but 1.6% of EU GDP. The gap has grown since then. In 2021, R&D spending was 3.5% of US GDP, but 2.2% of EU GDP. Relatedly, US firms tend to be faster adopters of new technologies, particularly information and communications technology. The share of ICT-related patents remains stable in the EU from 1995 and 2019, hovering around 15%. In contrast, this share has increased over time in the US to around 35% as of 2019. In summary, the US invests a lot more in innovation and adoption of new technologies than the EU, although I'm reminded of Robert Solo's comment that you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. The third fact to highlight is that there has been a decline in various measures of business dynamism within the US and the EU. Firm entry rates and the share of young firms in economic activity have declined. Industry concentration and markups have increased. Resource misapplication has risen. The gap between frontier productivity firms and laggards has increased, and job reallocation has declined. All of this suggests that the economic forces of creative destruction, which are so important to aggregate productivity, are declining. A notable difference between the US and EU, however, is that the growth of so-called superstar firms in the US, as coined by David Woodward and others, which has led to an increase in industry concentration, has not been as pronounced in the EU. So these are some of the main proximate drivers of the growing productivity gap between EU and US. I'm now going to turn to some of the deeper structural drivers that could be contributing to these patterns, focusing in particular on the extent of integration in product markets, financial markets, and labour markets. So let's start with product market integration. The EU single market has lowered trade barriers and harmonised many rules and regulations. However, these significant achievements, and despite them, the EU remains a more heterogeneous bloc than the US. Language differences can act as a barrier to trade, notwithstanding the dominance of English. Cultural differences manifest as differences in consumer tastes and preferences, and there remains scope to remove regulatory barriers and deepen the single market. As a result, high productivity firms in Europe have a harder time scaling up to be as large as their US counterparts. This limits resource reallocation across EU industries and countries relative to the US experience, lowering aggregate productivity. It also reduces the incentives of European firms to invest in R&D and innovate, which can lead to persistently lower productivity growth and therefore a widening productivity gap. Technological developments in IT, such as cloud computing and machine learning, may have amplified this dynamic by increasing the benefits of scale. Of course, there must be a balance between enabling firms to grow while ensuring that large incumbents don't become entrenched in their positions and block competition. And so an appropriate competition regulation framework is a very important policy tool. But beyond scale effects, there's also potentially more frictions and rigidities in EU product markets than in the US. Recent IMF work suggests that misallocation has worsened considerably in advanced economies, lowering TFB growth annually between 2000 and 2019 by 0.5 percentage points. Notably, the United States is the only exception, with allocative efficiency improving over the same period. There's a lot of variation across EU industries and countries in the extent of misallocation. Forthcoming work by economists at the Central Bank of Ireland explores this issue and quantifies the extent to which various rigidities, such as the information frictions and the difficulties firms face in adjusting their physical capital, worsen capital allocation and lower productivity across the EU. So now to financial market integration. Despite substantial increases in EU financial integration in recent decades, the US is considerably more integrated financial markets. Recent research has highlighted how differences in institutions across the countries, for example, across EU countries, for example, financial disclosure standards and creditor rights can matter for the concentration of firm ownership. So how might this contribute to the productivity gap between the US and the EU? On the one hand, entrepreneurs and young firms tend to have difficulty obtaining finance before they have built up sufficient revenue capital as collateral. Deeper and more integrated financial markets make it easier for financial institutions to diversify risk, enabling young firms to grow more quickly, driving business dynamism and hence productivity growth. On the other hand, the depth of financial markets also matters for large firms that already have access to finance. They affect the incentives of private firms to go public, and they can also shift the composition of public firm financing between debt and equity. A notable fact is that there is a greater reliance on debt, in particular bank finance in the EU, while US firms tend to have relatively greater reliance on equity as a source of finance. This matters because equity diversifies risk in a way that bank debt doesn't, potentially enabling firms to invest more in risky ventures. An important avenue for future research will be determining to what extent the differences in the depth of financial markets in the US and EU contribute to the gap in R&D spending. And finally, labour markets. Even though there is free movement of labour within Europe's single market, differences in language, culture, and institutions such as social security and tax rules make migration within the EU a lot more difficult than in the US. One result of this is that in response to economic shocks or new innovations, European firms may not be able to fill positions as rapidly as firms in the US. Beyond such relocation dynamics, however, an additional important feature of the US is its capacity to attract high-skilled migrants. Immigrants accounted for a quarter of new employer businesses in the United States in 2019, up from 18.7% in 2007, and are overrepresented in the high-tech industry and as founders of innovative firms. The agglomeration of skills in hubs such as Silicon Valley and top US universities generates important positive spillovers and plays a key role in driving US productivity growth. EU countries have not had the same success historically in retaining and attracting skilled workers, likely contributing to its relatively sluggish productivity growth. Lastly, aging populations may also impinge on productivity growth in both the US and EU. As people age, the benefits of know-how and experience may be offset by depreciation of skills and more limited innovation, although these effects will be very heterogeneous by occupation and sector. The different structure of labour market institutions between the US and the EU will mediate the effects of the demographic transition on productivity. More flexible labour markets alongside institutions enabling reskilling and retraining workers as they age will be all the more important in the face of population aging. In addition, the quality and widespread availability of healthcare will be key to ensuring improved longevity and years of healthy life, which will help offset negative effects of aging on long-run productivity growth. So let me just turn to the impact of the pandemic, the implications of continued widening of the productivity gap in the EU and the US, and the policy tools at our disposal to provide a boost to growth and productivity in Europe. And I'll also touch on the implications of the ongoing geoeconomic fragmentation. So on the impact of the pandemic, I think it's a bit early to tell whether there has been a change in the trajectory of productivity growth in the EU and US, not least because productivity growth, as I said earlier, has an important cyclical component. But it is worth noting that the US saw a dramatic increase in entrepreneurship following the pandemic, particularly in high-tech industries, with many of these new enterprises now becoming employer firms. Business applications for likely employer firms in 2023 were 30% above their 2019 levels. And in the fourth quarter of 2022, the share of gross job creation accounted for by new establishments reached 13% for the first time since 2004. In contrast, new business registrations in the EU for 2023 were less than 10% above the level in 2019, consistent with the pre-pandemic trend. The US and EU also took quite different approaches during the pandemic to protecting labour incomes, with the US largely insuring workers via unemployment insurance, and EU countries focusing on saving jobs through policies such as short-time work programs. While there are good arguments for both of these, the medium-term impacts of these policy choices on productivity are still playing out. And what if the EU and US productivity gap continues to widen? The first important implication is that divergent steady-state growth paths could imply different mutual rates of interest, R*, in the US and the EU, by which I mean different rates which keep the economy operating at potential without inflationary or deflationary pressures. This would in turn drive a wider gap between the policy rates required by the Fed and the ECB to maintain inflation on target, which could affect capital flows, exchange rates, and US-EU trade. Countries like Ireland, which are very connected to the United States, both through FDI and trade, might see exports benefit from the depreciation of the euro and the relatively strong expected performance of the US economy. But this is mediated by the fact that many multinational firms based in Ireland price in US dollars. A second implication is that low productivity growth in the EU will amplify fiscal pressures in the face of other mounting challenges, which will require significant government investment. So what can EU policymakers do? And a few thoughts on this. First, EU member states should continue to remove frictions in product and labour markets and harmonise rules and regulations across countries to improve the functioning of the single market, particularly for intra-EU trade and services. Second, it's important to ensure that competition policy frameworks are equipped to deal with the fast-changing environment in which we live in order to maintain the balance between innovation incentives and competition, particularly as artificial intelligence changes the business and technological landscape. Third, continued financial market deepening and integration within the EU, including through the capital markets and banking unions, as well as providing greater choice to savers and promoting macro-financial resilience. More developed capital markets can ensure that businesses' diversified financing needs are provided for, and that financial frictions don't act as a barrier to innovation and business dynamism. And finally, coordinated EU efforts which increase public investment in support of the development and adoption of new technologies, such as the next generation EU, can provide an important boost to productivity growth. Let me now turn to the theme of my remarks at your conference in Dublin last year. It's too soon to come to definitive conclusions on what the impact of geo-economic fragmentation will have on productivity, or on the differences in productivity between the EU and the US. But if we accept, as I do, that the growth of global interconnectedness over the last 50 years has seen greater efficiency, greater productivity, and greater prosperity for our communities, it is not far-fetched to argue that less interconnectedness could have a negative effect on productivity, if not global welfare. Policymakers will need good evidence based on thorough research to help them make best judgments here. For example, whether interference in the market so that domestic consumers pay to support inefficient domestic producers is in fact enhancing welfare overall. So let me conclude. Over the long run, the only way to increase living standards sustainably is by raising productivity. The slowdown of productivity growth over recent decades is therefore one of the major challenges we currently face. I've already outlined some domestic policy reforms and tools which may help reverse this trend. But this is not just a domestic policy issue. In Ireland, we're particularly aware of the important role of multilateralism and openness in driving growth. Multinational firms in Ireland employ over a quarter of the workforce, with diverse positive spillovers in the broader economy. The wonderful thing about innovation is that ideas are non-linear. Whether progress originates in the US, the EU, or anywhere else, we will all eventually benefit. Greater openness to the free movement of capital and the free movement of people has been an integral part of the EU project and will become all the more important as we look for global solutions to reigniting productivity growth and improving the well-being of all our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. A few questions to start off, and we'll also leave some time for questions from the audience. Can you explain why the ECB is moving ahead of the Fed, and whether you see that continuing?
I mean, you can put that question the other way around, which is why is the Fed not moving ahead of the ECB? But let's leave that aside. In the end, our mandate is price stability in Europe, and we started a pretty rapid hiking cycle in July of 22. We stopped in September of 23. We've been looking at, we've been adopting this meeting by meeting approach, looking at the data. And in the end, we concluded at our last meeting that we had enough confidence to move rates from a restrictive stance to a slightly less restrictive stance. As I said in my remarks, we come to decisions and looking at analysis. We do look at global macroeconomic developments, which include what's happening to monetary policy, whether it's in the United States or in Asia or whatever. And the question we ask ourselves is not necessarily really for us. The question we ask ourselves is how are all these developments affecting the European economy? So we made the decision we made. Are we going to, one of the very clear messages that President Gard made at the end of our meeting, 6th of June, is we have no predetermined path. We're going to continue to adopt a meeting by meeting approach. Our next meeting is whether the Fed moves before us, by then I don't know off the top of my head, but next Fed meeting is, I'm sure the Fed will make a decision based on what's happening in the US. So I think I'd worry less about which order people make decisions in. I think more about what's happening to the global economy. I think that's really where everyone is coming from. I mean, the important thing that everyone needs to be conscious of, and I hope it's not a surprise to them, but it's amazing the amount of times you have to keep repeating, but we are absolutely focused on delivering our 2% target over in a sustainable way. That's what we are.
Fair enough. Well, why don't we stay on the global theme? You mentioned geoeconomic fragmentation in your remarks. Can you expand on where you see the big issues and challenges going forward?
Well, I think there are many. The first challenge is to recognize that actually it is happening. I have a sense sometimes that people are talking about what might the implications be, but it's happening. Right, it's happening in a number of different ways. Firstly, it's happening by the fact that institutions that we collectively set up to sort of make this work are now not functioning. The World Trade Organization is not really functioning the way we anticipated. So that's one thing. Secondly, is the word that we very interesting here, but we've decided for good or ill that we won't put any of these tariffs. Thirdly, the pandemic in particular and the Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, led us to suddenly, including other things, incidentally, that ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal. We suddenly realized that our supply chains are quite sensitive, quite vulnerable. So thinking has suddenly gone sort of much more into let's try and more autonomous with our strategic supplies, inputs, etc. So we are seeing a world that is now choosing to be less connected. And as I said in my remarks, I mean, my gut feel is that it's too early to sort of give scientific definitive views whether this is, what exactly is the impact of this. But my instincts are that if you accept that a lot of the prosperity in the world over the last 50 years has been built on connectedness, the likelihood is that we're now entering a world where we're going to be less prosperous. There's more costs. The thing I worry about most is whether policymakers are really making judgments or a full understanding of what are the implications of that decision. And I'm not sure about. There are different drivers. Some of them are completely misguided, and some of them have an underlying good intent, but maybe the implications of that really haven't thought through. So incidentally, I'm going to use this word now, but I've almost stopped using it because it means so many things to people. The word globalization. I would use that word. because I use the word connectedness and international connectedness, because I think that gives a much sort of clearer sense of what we're doing. Connection of people, firms, ideas, capital, and so on. That's what really a lot of the prosperity and peace that we've had over the last 50 plus years has been built on. When we start sort of reducing that, is concerned.
Absolutely. Perhaps a question on Ireland specifically. Ireland's positioned itself as a gateway between the US and Europe. Can you give us your views on the Irish economy and how Ireland in particular is navigating any of these challenges?
Well, Ireland is I mean, the Irish economy is doing well. We are tomorrow, tonight, this time, going to be publishing the central bank's latest projections for the Irish economy. But in a nutshell, the economy continues to do well. It's actually operating capacity. We continue to have our projections are not as rosy as they were, say, in January 2023, but they're still pretty good. I mean, the impact of monetary policy is being through. But we've got we continue to have some of the lowest levels of employment. We've got record levels of participation. Inflation is on a downward trajectory as it's euro area. But operating at capacity means that there are some structural issues now that are coming to the fore. They've been around for a while, but are now risk slowing down growth. So we have a housing challenge, which is not to the world. We have a housing challenge and it's got to the stage now where businesses are finding it difficult to hire people because they can't be housed. So that's become, and I mean, this is anecdotal now, but you know, I've heard the story enough for me to feel like I'm repeating. Quite a few of the bigger businesses are now buying property to house and so that sort of constraint has become material. I mean, we're still an attractive place for people to want to come to. And a lot of the new jobs that we're creating in the last 5 years, 2/3 of them, so we're still like income direction. But the government's finances are in a very good position, subject to one thing which I mentioned earlier. We're considering Ireland post the financial crash have to ask for an IMF program. I mean, the recovery has been remarkable. The one sort of concern that I have is that some of the government's tax revenues are incredibly reliant on very few, very big multinationals. And you only need sentiment to change just slightly for those funds to sort of disappear. And I have encouraged, to be fair to the government, I've encouraged the government and to be fair to them, they follow through. Firstly, do not assume, I mean, we've calculated in the central bank what we see as excess corporation tax. And we've said, don't plan on spending this forever because it might look like that. And in fact, it would be better if you put it away. The government has created 2 wealth funds that are in the process of being set up right now. So that's a sort of good thing. Finally, the other sort of concern I have is again, it's a good concern, which is because the economy is doing so well. The government needs to be very careful in its fiscal policy. that it doesn't act too cyclically and add to inflation, lest it's another version of positive inflation. Because we're in a unique situation in Europe where we have a single monetary policy that covers 20 countries. There are 20 fiscal policies. So there's a much greater need for governments in those 20 countries to support monetary policy. Because individually, we can't, at Frankfurt, actually sort of target Irish inflation, for example. We target euro inflation. So that's something which I remain focused on. But in the end, I think the Irish economy, its growth rates are, well, we always have challenges measuring growth in Ireland because of the presence of the multinationals. But we're growing better than most of our European peers. And although our growth rates, our numbers are, so we don't tend to use GDP, central bank, so modified domestic demand, which sort of strips out some of the activities of multinationals. But the reality is that multinationals do employ big numbers of people. Although everyone is focused on the corporation tax that multinationals pay, there's a lot of income tax that's paid by the employees of these firms. And many of them are American. And I keep saying to my UK friends who keep talking about their special relationship between the United States, I keep saying to them, you think you've got a special relationship, you should see a special relationship that Ireland has, which is a very special relationship. And I think that one will continue. I think the links between the US and Ireland are strong and remain strong. The investment that we have in pharmaceuticals and big tech are long-term investments. The skilled labor force that we have. The beauty of the country, I know some of you have not been to Ireland, so you should go visit. Confirm what I just said. I think it would remain an attractive place to visit.
I'd like to take some questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please use your microphone and push the button to turn screen.
Thank you very much for the event, and in the best ECB tradition, maybe I have two questions. One would be, Governor McLaughlin, you said at the beginning that you thought you were still quite far away from neutral. I do remember last week there was a headline coming over Bloomberg, which got our traders quite excited from you. And the headline was, don't know how fast the ECB will carry on, if at all. And so people were saying, oh, look, there is somebody who doesn't know whether they will actually cut more. So I was just curious whether, and I must admit, I didn't see much more than the headline, and I don't know whether there was much more, but to kind of, whether you could maybe elaborate a bit, how these two things together, or maybe you were just misquoted. The other one on the productivity that you were talking about in the speech, it's very easy to be, and particularly when one is in the US, it's very easy to be a negative and bearish about Europe. There's all the time stuff going on that isn't great, such as currently with the French elections and all of that. But is there anything that gives you that makes you optimistic that things are actually going in a positive direction in Europe? Or would there be anything you would point to say, no, actually, that's a reason why things are indeed improving, rather than all the stuff one could point to on the negative side? Thank you.
I mean, I'm very positive about Europe. The thing is, markets and commentators are really focused on and you can't do it short term. You just sort of step back and ask yourself, what has Europe gone through in the last few years? The pandemic, war in Ukraine, we are much closer to the conflict in the Middle East. And economies working. And there is growth. There might not be as much growth as the United States. There is growth. There is a sense of a project that's ongoing, that's positive. It has to need to help a bunch of challenges, but they can be met. So I you know, at that sort of level, you know, when you think of my own sense is that Europe holds itself back from achieving its potential. The creativity and innovation that exists across Europe leaves me optimistic. I mean, I tend to be it's not the I tend to be an optimistic. I'm notwithstanding all the political challenges and so on. I think, again, if you think about where Europe has been for decades, I'm optimistic that's where it can be. When it comes to my comments the other day, firstly, I mean, there's a very interesting intellectual debate we had as to what is our stuff, where is our stuff. That's the precise thing. There was a conference a couple of weeks ago in Korea that one of my colleagues went to, devoted to our stuff. And I said to him when he came back, I said, okay, so what's the answer? And he said anywhere between minus 2, 3.5%. So he said, okay, that's very helpful. But so, you know, we use 2% as the sort of estimate in pensions, which is probably a sensible to proceed. I mean, I just think, honestly, it's just an interesting intellectual sort of debate. I'm more focused on what are the numbers telling me, and my confidence that we're on track to get inflation to 2%. My remarks last week were more reflective of the fact that I think we're not going very fast either, as opposed to we're not going to go faster downwards. That's still where I am. As I said in my remarks this morning, monetary policy remains restrictive. At some point, it'll be less restrictive because we will have confidence that we achieve that at the same time. But in the sort of time horizon that goes beyond next meeting, that's really good.
Governor, when you argue for appropriate policy, are you approaching it from what the Euro area should have or what Ireland should have?
What the Euro area,
And all your colleagues do it the same way generally?
and that's our duty. I mean, the reality is that 20 of us, there's 26 of us, 6 20 governments, all of us know our own country best. But the discussions of the room are about Europe, what we're seeing.
Thank you very much for your comments. There was an allusion to trade. Don was talking about or asked you about trade policies and that could be an impediment to productivity growth. Could you comment on the industrial policies that are currently in place in the US and also to some extent in Europe? Do you believe that that is enhancing or could potentially enhance over the long term productivity growth, but at the same time, it seems to be unleashing some constraints in terms of trade policy?
Yeah, So I think, and you're right to uh, both states. It's one of the things that appears to be is that we feel the need to follow the states. Now, generally speaking, industrial policy was I covered it from the perspective of somebody who has worked. I mean, I'm a social bank governor now, but I've worked in fiscal policy. So I'm one of these people who is sort of skeptical about the amount of value that is lost in government intervention. I mean, as we explained, industrial policy as a government intervention in markets. So I tend to be a skeptic because I've seen examples both through times I've lived in the history of industrial policy ultimately to oil emissions, oil waste. On the other hand, I'm not sort of, I'm also, one of the things that I like to say is intelligent thinking, not ideological thinking. So you gotta look at the facts. And in some countries of the world, industrial policy has, over a very long period, succeeded in lifting. I make no comment on sort of costs of it, but ultimately it's been successful. And that Korea, I would suggest, is a good example of that. But industrial policy does have, depending how it's designed, short-term consequences of impacts, especially if it promotes, if you design it to essentially promote your firms against other firms, that may not in the end. If actually other firms that are not. So the long and short of it, I think, is what exactly are you trying to do? How well designed are your policies? How well do you understand impacts of the actions you take? And when, this is the key one, when will you know that you've done enough? Draw a line or divert resources into something else. So, so in a nutshell, industrial policy has its place if it's done well. At some point, I'm also believe that industrial policy should step back and allow firms to innovate, be dynamic, do their own thing, rely on the knowledge to do it, as opposed to depending on government support. We have time for just one more question.
Thank you, Governor. That was really inspiring, and I'm going to be using international connectedness instead of globalization. I may or may not give you credit for that. But I'm Barbara Simmons. Okay. I'm Barbara Simmons, Vice Chair of the International Law Section of National Bar, and we're in discussions with the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. In your talk, you mentioned the role of, or possibly the impact of, an older workforce that we have, like here in the United States and in Europe. On the continent of Africa, of course, it has a very young workforce. But can you talk about the implications you see of that in relationship to international connectedness with the rest of the world?
Well, that's a big question. I think at one level, what is pretty clear is that in Europe and States, frankly, any country that is aging from the way that we're seeing, if people want to maintain their living standards, perhaps they actually want to improve them, let's say that it's maintained, they're going to need workers from some. And if Africa is producing lots more young people, or Asia or anywhere, Asian societies are going to need younger people to help sustain their living standards. Some people may think that AI will solve all this and you'll be able to do it all by day. I think one of the interesting challenges for as you mentioned Africa, this is a new challenge, which is in the end, I think you want to make sure that Africa doesn't just become the source of labor for Europe or wherever, but actually is a source of innovation for itself. And that's important. The reality is that we're going to need workers in Europe, wherever they come from, just to keep our living standards at levels that we're got used to. And sorry, this is a massive, massive issue. And people are not spending enough time talking about aging societies. And it's more than just the lack of workers. The reality is that a lot of our existing, there's an assumption that when people get into their 60s, they're going to stop working. I mean, what medicine is telling us is that people will get into their 70s and are going to want to carry on working. And we're going to think about what this longevity means for example, the education system. You know, in history, we spend, I think that's been very general here, we spend the first 20 years of our life sort of studying. We spend the next sort of 40 years of our lives sort of working in the story, 20th century, 40 years of our life working. And then maybe 10, or likely 20 years post-work. The reality is that the post-work time spent is now going to double. And the idea that you're going to rely on the 20-year study to sort of meet the needs of an 80, it just doesn't make sense. Right? So we have to rethink our education system. Are we going to put all the education and people into those first 20 years? Or will it become part of, you know, sort of life cycle? Then you can take time out at some point in your 40s and retrain, because your working life is going to sort of be as long as it was behind. Anyway, these are sort of massive questions. I hope people are thinking about them. I think about them because I have other things to think about.
Thank you very much for a very interesting session. We're going to go to a short break before we continue, but please join me in thanking Governor.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to come back to your seats so we can start the next session? The next session is labor markets and immigration. And I will ask the chair of the session to join us, Kathleen Stevenson, Vice Chair of GIC and in charge of the College of Central Bankers. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
College of Central Bankers.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And so as George mentioned at the onset of this conference, the theme is really about labor markets. And I think that our conversation on labor markets is a perfect segue to the governor's comments on productivity growth. Joining me for this conversation with two very distinguished speakers. We will start with Rajiv Dhawan, who is a professor of economic, actually he is chair of economic forecasting and director of Economic Forecasting Center at the Robinson College of Business, which is at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And he has particularly been very accurate in forecasting over the years, forecasting inflation, which of course, you know, for all of us, it's really, including central banks, it's a very difficult task. Also joining us is Holly Wade, who is the executive director of the NFIB, and she will tell you what it is, research center for small businesses, and she conducts original research and studies public policy effects on small businesses. She produces the monthly small business economic trends, which the whole market is waiting for with a lot of excitement, only to be disappointed because by and large, it is always some business, isn't that true? But anyways, with no further delay, I will invite Rajiv to come and present his views on the labor market.
Thank you, Kathleen. Figure out how to go in and out. Oh, so Kathleen gave a great intro to me saying I'm the expert on inflation. So I decided no more talk about inflation today. I'm inside the Federal Reserve, stick to a topic, which is labor markets. And I titled it Labor Market Analysis from the dollars and cents perspective. Okay, so I'm going to give you that, my way of looking at it. And I'm also going to go a little bit into the regional side too. As she said, I am the director of the Economic Forecasting Center. We do the US economy and the local region. So I get to look at both the things. And I had to devise a tool that I'm going to show you today. It's called the Triangle of Money, as a battlefield creation of mine in 2003-4 in Atlanta, when I was looking at the data that was coming out different ways, and you will see what it means. And I used that tool to do the regional, and recently I had enough evidence to do it at the national economy. Previously said, why didn't you do it before? Nobody asked. So what are the two employment measures saying? So you've seen that in the media. Those who know, there is the establishment of the non-farm payroll survey and the household survey. Different types. The blue line shows you a flattening in the year-over-year growth rate, but still pretty decent. After the moderation in 2022-23, this is flattening. And the darker line shows you kind of like, oops, bombs away. So if you do this thing in the last 6 months, the household survey shows a loss of 783,000 jobs, whereas the non-farm payroll survey, which is the bigger sample, a lot of differences, it's 1.5 million jobs. So you got divergent views. So how do you make sense? I'm going to show you. In between, because this panel had the name immigration too, there was an article in Wall Street Journal saying the difference could be all because of mismeasurement of population, because of migration, immigration, both legal and illegal, blah, blah, blah. But that's the only comment I'm going to make about immigration. Take it with a grain of salt. That's too much. Let's look at it by doing it. So last year, when Mark Zuckerberg was laying off people at Facebook, he wrote a letter to his employees, which was published in this thing called Variety. And I get to read all this stuff. My job is great. Every morning, 5 newspapers and anything else I like to read. They pay me for that. I'm very grateful. Don't tell them that. They think I do something more. So in his letter, he wrote, this is the year of efficiency. We'll make our organization flatter by removing multiple layers of management. Code word, those of you who have gone through the 90s, when I was starting my career, I saw the banks and the aerospace industry in California go through brutal retrenching of the middle management. And I remember in those days, every time a company announced they are going to do lay off the people or do some compression on the cost, stock market would go up. That was my image of 1996, before there was a tech bubble, right? So he says, today, many of our managers have only a few direct reports. I want to make it so they have 10. So if they had previously 3 managers managing 10 people, now it's going to be 1, so 2 will be laid off. So leaner is better. And if you look at the announced corporate layoffs from the Challenger data, January of 2023 was a pretty big number, followed by a little bit of a moderation in the layoffs. And this year, January was strong, February was even stronger, March was even bigger than that, and things are pretty high. So that's another way to look at the economy of the labor market, that when it comes to middle management, corporate tech jobs, there is a problem. There is a job compression going. I use the word job compression. So MBAs struggle with finding a job, and there was a headline, half the college grads are underemployed. There's multiple reasons for that. I'm in the university, so I won't go over there. So here's my triangle of fun. When you look at the jobs number, there is always, and I deal with the local real estate and all that in Atlanta, it was like, you hear the jobs numbers, start building. And they did great in the 90s, but the rest of the economy in the US was going through the jobless recovery. They were doing great. But now I was telling them in 2003 and 4, take a breather, go through the longer side. Jobs create income. Income leads to real estate. There's a feedback as usual. Don't be in a rush. What is happening is in my area, the data was telling that the Atlanta, Georgia area has created 40 to 50,000 jobs. And I was saying, looking at the income metrics like state tax collections, where's the money? They're falling. So I used to insult a couple of countries in Europe and other places saying that, but here in the US, people pay taxes, and I'm tired, mostly. So if you're creating jobs and they're very well paying or decently paying, you'll be collecting some income tax, and they will be showing up in the sales tax reports. It wasn't showing up. So look at that. So I'm going to use the same metric over here. This is a graphic that took a lot of time to design. It shows you, this is the average in the last 6 months overall. And this was the average from January 22 to July 23. You can do it different months. It's the same thing. So moderation is coming in lots of sectors, but I'm going to come to the middle ones, the corporate, the manufacturing, the wholesale and trade, B2B, and finance, and information, and where is it increasing? Education and health, and government sector. Now, these two combined is about 1/3 of the economy by employment. So these, now the next thing is to do it by, what is the average salary? So if you notice, this is from 2021 numbers. I've not been able to find anything after that. So if anybody finds it, please let me know. This is the average for that sector. And this is what I call the bread and butter of the middle class white collar middle management area. Nice paying. And this is also decent. So the issue is what's going on. I call it I was trying to take a trademark and it was very mouthy. White collar middle management job. Now we can understand the angst of a lot of the people when you look at the data and you say job growth, this thing, but the consumer confidence, consumer sentiment down. So you can start to understand a little bit. Because if I look at my students graduating, what kind of jobs are they getting or how quickly they're getting? It's not the same thing as it was before COVID. So it's not, another way to look at this thing is, which is a very geeky one, that was very fancy, but this is more easier. If you're familiar with multiplier analysis, you will understand these words, catalyst sectors, downstream and tertiary. Okay, starting, middle, and the end. So I put all the sectors according to the pay grade over here, the range. And I'm gonna look at the same thing. What was the average job growth of the total? That's the green. Everything seems to be in proportion to the share of the economy. And now, look at this. So the well-paying jobs is only 10% of the total by counting all these things big time. Yes, manufacturing is adding, but not the corporate that much, information not that much, wholesale not that much. You saw that. Finance is doing it. So if you put it all together, it's only 10%. So this is about 35% of the economy producing 10% of the jobs, and that's the whole key, showing the money. Okay. But for political purposes, it's always good to say jobs are being created, and you all know it in the non-farm payroll survey. If you're working in hospitality sector, apart from the owner and the general manager probably of the restaurant, nobody's working full time. Everybody's got multiple part-time jobs. And if the inflation pressure comes in and they go take a third part-time for 5 hours, that's also counted as one job. And the quality. So you can see that. Now, that sector, just the federal, state, and local, which is about 15% of the economy, is producing 20%, 23, 24% of the jobs. So what about the income? So US Treasury receipts, I did it by income tax. You can do it by the total tax collections. This is the quarters in 2022 when the job growth was very big. And then comes in the 2 quarters which were negative, year-over-year comparison. And then the second quarter of 2023, I'm doing it by calendar, was big. Like, what's going on? I didn't see the layoffs numbers and all that. They were there. Well, delayed California returns. All that rain and everything in California and the fires, Californians got extension till October to pay. So I waited, and the October payments show up in the 4th quarter, right? By definition. And it did show up. But if you do the average, this is what I learned from AC Harvey's class. If you do these outliers, you need to average them, compare these 2 quarters to the previous 2 quarters, the drop is still about 20% year-over-year. Okay. If you do the entire year 2023 versus the entire year 2022, the drop is still 15%. So jobs are being created. I don't care. Show me the money. Is there firepower? That can explain the spending, the other things, big ticket, small ticket items. You can do that. The first quarter was pretty decent year-over-year. Now, if you want to do it from state perspective, my income tax in my area, going same in sync. I don't know why we also dropped in the second quarter. I think the stock market effect, capital gains, stock options, other stuff. That's the payment time. We didn't have any delays. But now ours are more negative. There's always a feeling that the smaller states are usually the harbingers of what's happening at the rest of the economy. If you believe that, then this is telling you that things are not so good. And so that's one way of looking. So now then we go to the next part of have the corporate tech layoffs abated. So I took the 2 sectors, corporate and information, which is about 17% of the economy, and looked at the growth rates in California. The peak was in 2022. You can see the decline and some recovery, but they're still negative. Do that Washington, that's where the layoffs were. Oregon, that's where the tech firms are, all these areas. I put my Georgia in there. We also have some tech area. Texas, not as bad, but everybody had the same profile. North Carolina, we compared it to that. Raleigh Triangle is showing the same thing. But the good news is This year's numbers are not as bad year over year, but they're not somewhere to say, hey, the number is back to positive 2% and we are adding to the income. So, and this is the US number average. So there is a brand new building built in the middle of the town. This is what this building looks like, not an old building, built during the COVID. 2% occupancy was given back to the lenders 3 months ago. 2%. According to the newspaper report, not my numbers. So this also shows you the type of jobs being created, right? If you can work from home, other things, you don't need that much of office space. So other part of the way of looking at the economy is looking at in-migration domestic, not the international, and you can do that too. And you can see the states which were typically losing and now who's gaining, and you can see before COVID and after COVID. My South is gaining jobs, even Alabama, Louisiana is consistently losing jobs. Now I come to the states like Washington, Oregon, Virginia, Arizona. They were 2012, they were gaining people. Now, most of them are losing people except for Arizona. So you can see change before COVID, after COVID, and during the COVID. Then I also look at mountain states. Utah was getting a lot of people as a proportion of the population. This was huge numbers, moderated this year. Some other mountain states. And then I had the luxury, I looked at things around Boston. Which states are there? And notice one thing, I call it northeastern mountain states. So trying to copyright that. NEMS. Notice they were losing population in 2012. Now look at it, 25,000 people came in 2022. That would be equivalent to, if I do the population corrections correctly, would be equivalent to Georgia gaining 150,000 people, certainly. So if everybody knew during the COVID, people left Boston, bought it nearby. So you can see that. So now you can look at the home prices over here, except there's always some localized issues. So places like California and Washington, with the job layoffs out and everything, this is the home price compression from the peak in that area till now. Okay. Notice one thing, Seattle, San Francisco, negative big double digits. San Diego is positive in the same state. Because if you look at the data a little bit more closely, I used to live in California, LA and San Diego. Or a good nice beach volleyball over there. It's a nice little town in 1990s. Not the way it is now. Localized thing. People within California moved to San Diego and Latin American connection. Whereas the other states, those two cities, are more foreign buyers, but mostly from Asia on the margin. Okay, so you can see the difference. So real estate has localized thing too. And all these other places which were hot are not so hot now, even Texas, Dallas. Now you can say, what about Austin? Austin, I don't have the numbers from the S&P case Schiller with the big cities, so I can't show you the Austin. Even the Northeast, even the Midwest is positive because pricing matters, right? You can see New York and Boston. Foreign buyers there, they're back. Rest of the US people are still moving too. And of course, in the South, everybody is positive, except I don't know what's going on in Tampa.
Brady retired.
Listen, so real estate has some localized things. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna end with a cartoon about the workforce joke. So bear with me. I think I have a minute or so. I need to take off my glasses to read this thing. So mom's packing the lunch and she says, today's lunch is a peanut butter and honey sandwich. And the boy, this is from Baby Blues, the boy says, yes. And she says, you really like that stuff, huh? He says, I don't know. I have never eaten one. And she says, they have too high of a trade in value. And so we're not bad. So this is our future options treatment. So with that, I will end and have Holly come over.
Thank you. It's great to be with everybody. I forgot to include some cartoons, so forgive me. Mine is purely boring and straightforward, but illuminating graphs that will hopefully spur some conversation. I work at the National Federation of Independent Business. We're the largest advocacy organization located in DC, supporting small businesses across the country. We have roughly 300,000 members of our organization. Most of our members are employer businesses, roughly between 5 to 10 employees, and we span all industry segments. So the most concentrated, though, are in manufacturing, services, construction, agriculture, wholesale, retail, all of the big ones. And so for 50 years, thankfully with 300,000 members, we're able to do a lot of good survey work, getting an idea of the small business economy. Our chief economist, Bill Dunkelberg, 50 years ago, created our survey, and we've been publishing it ever since. It started off as a quarterly survey in the fourth quarter of 1973. And then we decided we wanted updated information monthly. So we made our members and Dung, as he is most known, to up the frequency of our survey. And so now we have the publication every month. We release our data the second Tuesday. And so the May data was published last week. So I'm able to showcase the May data, and we'll start with our headline measure of the small business economy, which is our optimism index. However, it has not been very optimistic lately, so we have flipped it to call it the pessimism index, which seems to be more appropriate for the last number of years. But this is 10 questions within our survey, mostly forward-looking, and it's a way to kind of headline measure, evaluate where small business owners are at the moment. So as you can see over the last, and sorry, just for clarification, the dotted black line is showcasing the most current data point so that we can see where we are compared to where we've been. So as I've said, our optimism index is historically very low over the 50-year history. It has been years now since we have been above or at our 50-year average of 98. But it did improve this last month, which was a good sign. Most of the index components that are supporting the optimism index right now are the labor questions. So unfilled job openings and hiring plans are amazingly supporting this very low index number. The main contributor to our low index is business conditions over the next 6 months, where the majority of our members are saying that they anticipate them getting worse than better. It's interesting because for the most part, when they talk about, business conditions in the next 6 months getting worse, you generally think of slower sales, of pending recession, or maybe say an election that the results will have a negative impact on the operations of a small business. They anticipate higher taxes or higher regulatory burden, something of that nature. Right now, it is a lot to do with, although the two components, as I mentioned, employment are supporting the index at the moment, Their frustration is not finding enough workers and having to work in their business more than they typically do, and not able to operate their business as an owner, but almost now as filling in for those positions that they aren't able to fill. And then the big one, which, you know, as you were mentioning that you did want to talk about, inflation is about all that they can talk about. The higher costs of inventory and supplies is still a prevalent factor for most small business owners. And whether that is securing, many of them still say that they have supply chain disruptions. It has eased off quite a bit. We don't know where kind of the baseline level of the population of small business owners that would just always typically say that they have a supply chain disruption. We did start that question at the beginning of the pandemic to see kind of where we were, but there's still this handful of small business owners that are having challenges in that area also. But inflation is the big problem, along with labor quality or finding applicants for those open positions. And it's still making life very difficult for small business owners in operating their business. Taxes and regulations are starting to creep up in there, especially if you're in the state of California. I always like to beat up on California. It is a magical state, but it is entirely too difficult to operate in for a lot of small business owners, and it seems to be increasing. So that is so for those members in California, that's what we're hearing, but still inflation and labor quality. So looking at the two components of labor, we ask a question: what is your single biggest problem in operating your business at the moment? And we offer 9 categories, whether it's inflation or competition with larger businesses, insurance costs, taxes, regulations, and 2 of them are labor costs and labor quality. So both of them are historically high, costs less so as a major factor, but still over the 50-year history, about 10% are saying that the cost of labor is their biggest issue. So not surprisingly, small business owners have had to compete for talent. They've increased compensation. Most small businesses are a bit more limited in the benefit or compensation package that they can offer employees. So what we're talking about is mostly straight wages as far as the increase in compensation costs that they're experiencing. Most small business owners under the threshold of around 20 don't offer health insurance. It's a very small cohort. So we are looking at wages as being the dominant way to attract. And 10% are saying that that is their biggest problem. For still about 1 in 5 small business owners, and this has fallen off a bit since its peak a number of years ago, but about 1 in 5 are saying the quality of labor. And this is, you know, looking at those applicants that they're finding to fill those positions. They are lowering their minimum qualifications. They're doing more to train in-house. They are offering all sorts of accommodations for those who don't have any experiences. And that has turned into a huge frustration for a lot of small business owners, since generally speaking, it is for, as is the case with all businesses, but for small businesses, it's a more constraining, limiting factor, is they're using their most talented employee or the owner themselves into increasing the training in-house that's available for those that they're onboarding. And many of them are saying that the turnaround of those who they're training in-house, onboarding, and them leaving for a better job outside of the business is a struggle. And so how much of their resources are they spending on that versus trying to find kind of the perfect applicant is one of the pressure points that many small business owners are facing. I wanted to show this because so much of the discussion around labor is related to what industry you're involved in. And looking at the percent that have a job opening that is difficult for them to fill from last year to this year. So construction still is the industry that has having the most challenging time finding employees or finding applicants to fill those positions. It has leveled off since last year. Last year we were 63%, and now we're at about 54. Manufacturing, transportation services, all of those industries that are likely not a surprise to anybody that we've read about in the paper. Interestingly, when I was putting this together and looking at finance, we don't have many finance members in our membership. So I think there were maybe 3 or 4 that were on a hiring spree in this last month compared to last year. But those that have fallen off, wholesale has fallen off a bit, and same with agriculture. What's a bit interesting with our numbers and in the industry categories, most of our members have been around since before the pandemic. So these are businesses that were established 10, 20 years ago and are having to adjust and figure out how to operate in a different way to accommodate for a lot of these problems that they're facing. We did find a huge spike in business formations. So the number of businesses that were online, or not online, but formed and operated since the pandemic has been staggering. And those businesses are likely a bit better off, I would presume, in that they started under those conditions of a tight labor market, inflation, all of that. So they're starting off in not having to adjust their business and having those expectations of higher costs for inventory and supplies and things like that. They were going into it in this challenging environment and starting their business to accommodate for all of that. So when talking to our members, it is particularly frustrating because they know what it felt like to operate under more supportive conditions for their business. As I was saying, actual compensation and planned compensation. So the challenge here for small business owners is while fewer are planning to increase compensation, they're having to do it anyway. And so not being able to anticipate or plan and still feeling that pressure to increase compensation to retain the current employees, but also attract applicants is a challenge. And right now we're seeing that spread between the percent saying that they're actually increasing compensation and those planning. The gap is about as large as we've seen. And that's a struggle for small business owners who think that maybe those labor conditions the pressures are easing up, but in fact, they're not, and they're still having to compete strenuously for talent. And then my final slide is looking at qualified job applicants. So we asked, how many applications have you received for those open positions? And so in the Great Recession, in 2008 to about 2012, we saw very few saying that they had few to none applications. They had a lot of applications. Everybody was looking for a job. Unfortunately, very few small business owners were also hiring at that time because we were still digging ourselves out. But now we've seen that those who report none have leveled off. But again, over the 50-year period, or I guess this question started in about 1993. So over that period, this is the highest level still of those saying that they have 0 applicants for those open positions, and still very high levels of those saying that they only have a few. And so this is still the struggle. They're showing or telling us that it is one of their main problems in operating their business. And so that's the general picture of the small business labor outlook, and we will have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Rajiv and Polly.
And I will take the liberty to start the conversation here before we open it up to the audience. So both of you, I think, have alluded to somewhat of an easing, let's say, of labor market conditions. And the question is, for both of you, quite rapidly, I should ask, whether this is the beginning of a weaker labor market condition as such, that is more related to the cyclicality of businesses, and which could prompt the Fed to act maybe sooner than what is, as of yesterday, priced in the market, given Neil Kashkari's comments that it will be later this year. So that's the first possibility. The second one is that we are still very much in the structural dynamics, and that the slightly weaker conditions is really the view that this is a normalization of the labor markets, a more balanced, perhaps, labor markets, given the disruptions that we've seen during the pandemic and during the supply chain that we have seen. So which one? Oh, go ahead.
I think, well, small business owners are certainly looking for anything that resembles normal for them. And that will give them back time. That's one of their main challenges, is balancing their time between being an owner and thinking strategically about their business versus having to be part of business operations on the ground. And so normalizing the labor market, all of that, it will likely, as I see from the data of larger firms versus smaller firms, it might take a bit longer for small business owners to get there because, you know, their compensation packages might not be as robust as a larger company. And so they're still struggling. We've seen a bit of easing in there, but, you know, as the slide showed, it's still very historically high numbers of those that aren't able to fill positions and are looking to hire going forward.
So more structural. perhaps.
Yes.
Reggie, would you?
My analysis was looking more at, I would call it, using the word bifurcated labor market. If you're looking at the corporate, white collar, middle management jobs, over there, it is really bad news. But if you want to hire, like in the service industry, there are shortages. And that shows up in the income data another way too, which I didn't have the time to put up the chart, that I showed you the total income tax collection, and I can show you the total tax collection. The total tax collection has another component called corporate taxes and some excise duties and all that, which are pretty small. But there's one other important component. What are the people paying as the Social Security contribution and Medicare contribution? There is no drop. And that tells you that they are hiring when the hospitality worker is working. Let's say he or she is only making $10,000. They will be, this is theoretical. We economists like to do theoretical form filling. They're working, they made the 10,000, there's no income tax rate, it's totally exempt, but you got to pay the Social Security tax. There's no exemption. So that's why up to that Social Security limit, whoever is making has to pay that number. No tax rate is constant, right? So you see that is growing at 14%. But what's not growing is that you are working a white collar job, you haven't had a pay raise in 5 years in a corporate headquarters working in marketing or this thing, and you're worried about your future prospects, but they are laying off the management layers. So what is going to be your inclination if you do it by the permanent income hypothesis? You're going to cut back on your durable goods consumption. Let's not upgrade the car. Let's not buy the new washing machine. And no way I'm going to do the kitchen upgrade, which used to be 25,000. Now people are telling me if you get done less than 75, you're a lucky person. Because labor cost is the problem over there, apart from the material.
Well,
So in a sense, is this because of pandemic, post-pandemic. Part of it is there. But I think this is a structural change that we saw in the 90s when the technology came in. The industries that took the brunt was corporate side, especially the banking and everything. They got rid of the tellers and the other people. Aerospace, because of the peace dividends. I saw that in California very clearly. 250,000 people laid off in 5 square miles. You know what that does to the local economy? Ask the home prices in Beverly Hills and Bel Air between 92 and 96. They were dropped by 30 to 40%. So what's happening at the national level, I've seen it before at the local level, but it used to be local. Now it's all over. And you can see in the home prices how the movement of the people, economic things and other things create the difference. So I don't like to use the word recession anymore. It's a pre-pandemic creation by the economists. Look at the economy, give it up. You've already seen compression in areas, I like to use the word compression, whether it's income or jobs, and you have to do it by sectoral. The trouble for these central banks is that they have to look at the whole thing together, and it becomes a challenging way to figure out what to do, when to do the rate cuts. So if you're coming from an area like Midwest, which again, used to be always an outflow of people from there. In my 30 years plus in the US, now it's the reverse. People are going back to those areas.
Well, so you can argue that, the structural changes have been exacerbated or maybe, you had to accelerate it by the pandemic and the supply chains. And you should see these really major changes that are happening. But, you mentioned one thing about, what it was, defense.
Defense industry.
So, there's an article in today's FT, and this has an impact not only in Europe, but in the US as well. Very interesting, I thought. They had a survey that shows that global defense sector is surprising, booming, right? And as a result, these large corporations are now looking for, to hire. Here in the US, Lockheed Martin, the other two, and they are looking for close to 6,000 jobs to be created. In Europe, it's almost like 37,000 jobs to be created. Almost 10% of the sector's economy, and it is covering the spectrum from apprenticeship to career executive. So to what extent are we starting to see yet another maybe structural rather than cyclical dynamic here that could disrupt and make it much more harder to draw conclusions of what is the state of the labor market?
Well, the manufacturing sector where the defense industries would come in is now if you do the overall numbers, like 9% of the employment base. And if you look at any state, manufacturing employment is growing. So when I was putting that into that category with all the other ones, because the mindset is starting sector, catalyst, and the spillover multiplier. But over there, if we just divide it by white collar, which means you can do the job remotely or you have to go to the office in person, if you're still going, versus you have to be in a factory floor doing something, then it's a bifurcated economy there. And the only problem is that 7%, 9% of the economy cannot create the momentum for the rest of the thing. It will do its own local multiplier, but it's not going to lift the entire boat. Whereas if you go back to the 1960s and you started a new manufacturing concern and a new plant, it would just put the multiplier all throughout the system. Because at that time, 4 out of 10 people worked in manufacturing.
Well, and there we have the reshoring. We've got, the AI situation, to what extent, that seeps into the various, the economy in the various sectors, creating new jobs, which actually, as we were pointing out, the educational system has to be rethought in order for all this absorption to take place.
Yeah, the IT people getting out of the university with a computer science degree are having trouble finding a job right now for two reasons. One, all the tech firms in the tech areas are in contraction mode and basically they're hiring, but they're hiring very selectively. And second, they say we don't have anything on the AI. So in the marketplace, there's a demand for the AI-based tech worker, but we don't have it. So they're trying to do courses, technology here and there. When you know what happens when this kind of thing opens up, there's a lot of unscrupulous elements selling you stuff, saying pay us $5,000, we're gonna teach you AI courses. That happens too, because the companies don't know how to hire it. They want the AI person, but they don't know how to hire it from the young worker coming out from the university. They're poaching each other's existing work is the easiest way.
Well, so the moral of that story, immigration to essentially not have, to have a growth in the sector. But we are past 11. I will perhaps ask if we could go to 11:05 and open it to 2 questions for the audience. Yes, sir.
On the small business chart on the optimism.
Yes.
It's interesting that there's such a significant difference between 2017 and 2019 and 2021 to 2024. Why were the small four? And so that's a big, I think regulation might be
Taxes.
what is it?
Taxes.
Taxes. Okay.
Yes, so the promise of the Trump administration's tax policy on lowering the corporate rate and providing a small business deduction, the 20% on qualifying business income. But also then the promise of stalling out or even trying to reduce the regulatory burden for small firms that are disproportionately difficult for small firms to either pay for or comply with. And so that was one of the most significant components was the business conditions looking 6 months ahead of small business owners thinking that it was going to get better than worse. And then from 2021 to 2024, I mean, a lot of that had to do with inflation and also kind of the regulatory environment, not so much the tax environment because the tax policies have been in place, which will sunset the end of next year. So that's a huge concern for them going forward. But the regulatory component, especially in a lot of the states that have either increased minimum wage, which disproportionately impacts small firms, all of those sorts of things. But inflation and labor and being able to manage those two challenges has been primarily why the index has been so low over the last number of years. But yes, before it was all tax and regulations.
Another question? Yes.
I'm curious,
That's great. Here we go. You started with, and this kind of goes with small businesses too, I think, but maybe more so with the biggest. You started with Mark Zuckerberg wanting to trim everybody down. To a certain extent, have those of us who want to work at home kind of dug our own employment graves, because the more that these jobs can be done, not in the US, if you don't have to be in the office, then why can't I find anybody anywhere in the world to do these jobs? Is that part of the trend you think we're seeing now? And is that to a certain extent then structural? Certainly in white collar type jobs, a job where you're not on a factory floor, but you're doing something like managing people. Gosh, if people are at home, do you need to manage this much, et cetera? How do you see that trend playing out?
I would say it's already playing out. That's why you see no kind of job growth in the well-paying, even in the corporate sector, professional business services. You don't see the job growth in the higher paying one. You see the job growth in the admin side. You still need some people to work, even if they're working remotely. You still need them. The issue is, why can't everything go outside? There's always the cost and benefit. There is a benefit of putting it long distance, but the cost is time zone change, language, culture, ease of doing things. And so that thing has been going on for 20 years. I remember late 90s at UCLA, we gave our students an exercise in this class that can you put the back office operation. We said we gave the example of a Wall Street firm that had moved from New York to Florida, its back office operations. Can you put that in India? That's all we asked in 1998. And the team, which had an engineer and different types of people, actually came up with a proposal to put up their own satellites up in orbit and have the communication connectivity. And it was cost effective. Jaws just dropped. What I saw later on is what internet did. The cheap internet, you could do the email and do the attachment more than 1 megabyte. Remember the days when the emails did not have attachments? That was the time we're talking about 1998. And they said for having the bandwidth, we will have to put up our own satellites, our own communication, and it's cost effective. The engineer in that group did that calculation. And that's exactly what happened 2-3 years later. So technology is going to do it. This AI, I'm not so negative about it. Look at what you call the skill base of the current workforce coming up. AI is going to help all those skill bases that we complain about, they don't have it. AI will do it for them. It's going to be a complementary. It's going to be substituted in certain places where we have a labor shortage, but it's going to complement it. So I'm not the doom and gloom about that we will all be jobless and all that, but it's already happened.
I would say for small firms, the AI component, those new firms are utilizing and figuring out how to incorporate that into business operations more than those existing firms that, when we ask about adopting new technologies for existing firms, it's mostly, that's for the next owner to figure out. I'm not equipped to deal with that. And so when we transition, whether it's, selling their business or passing it down generationally, that's when that turnover of technology mostly happens in a kind of a spike. But offshoring, that's always been something not generally available for small firms and trying to navigate the connections that would be necessary for that. But AI, I think, is one of those areas that will be helpful for small businesses, especially those that are starting out and newly formed, incorporating those new technologies on the front end.
So with that, please join me to thank our two speakers. Apologize for the fact that it's truncated big time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start the next panel, the next session. At this stage, I would like the next panel to come and join us. And I would like to ask the chair of the panel. Michael Uri, the former chair of GIC and frequent speaker, to give us the tone of the session. Michael, it's all yours.
I sit on.
All right.
On.
You're not on yet.
Hello.
My name is Michael Burry, and I'm a board member of the Global Interdependence Center, and George, who is a former chairman, played out, former chairman. I'm with Dana Peterson, the chief economist of the Conference Board, who is a fellow board member at GIC, and Brendan Moriarty, who is with SIA Partners. He came to us today from New York.
Yes.
SIA also is based in Dublin, and they were presenters at our conference in Dublin a year ago with President Macron. We're going to talk about, well, it says economic outlook. It's really more corporate strategy.
More generally, we have two panels today on labor. We've already had one and there's one this afternoon. So we're going to try to skirt around labor, but seeing as it's 50% of business costs, that's a little hard to do. So I'm going to ask the first question in kind of a more general sense, which is, what do you two see corporations doing with pricing in general? In terms of, are they passing along higher labor costs? Are they raising prices to protect margins? Are they exercising cost control to protect those margins? Or in some cases, we see now, are they lowering prices to maintain volume? So just kind of a general, where are the corporations on inflation relative to their cost pressures?
It's all of the above. It really depends upon the industry and, just a little insider thing here, the conference board is a business think tank and our members are CEOs and CFOs of Fortune 500 companies. So we're talking to the movers and shakers every day. And so some of them are saying, look, we have to retain our workers, our best talent. So we're just raising wages and benefits and hey, we're not going to absorb all that. So we are passing it on to the customer. And that's especially true in those sectors that are experiencing pretty significant labor shortages. Then you have all of them are cutting back on costs, but they're not cutting back on costs when it comes to employment because they need those workers and they're losing workers to retirement hand over foot. So with that, companies are passing along as much as they can in terms of inflation. Some companies are, trying to make sure that their margins aren't compressed too much. So they're doing, a little bit of cost cutting in terms of investing in structures and anything other than tech, but they're holding on to their workers again. And when we ask businesses, what are you planning? CEOs of the largest firms, what are you planning in terms of employment? Most of them are saying, we're just going to hold on to whomever we have. Right, so we call that hoarding. HR calls that retention, and that's raising costs. And even we ask CEOs, these same CEOs, what are you thinking about in terms of raising wages? They said, anywhere from 3 to 4% over the next year, and that's significantly higher than the just under 3% average that we saw wages growing between the Great Financial Crisis and the pandemic. So companies are saying, look, we need to do this. But then other companies, especially those that I call, the pandemic darlings. So that's tech, finance, residential construction, transportation and warehousing. Those companies did really well during the pandemic. Now there's less demand for them. So they're right sizing. So certainly you're seeing reduction in cost from labor from that. But you also have a number of companies, I would say, of necessities, like the ones who are producing food, energy, especially the food ones, they are reducing prices because they're experiencing pressure. Retail, definitely reducing prices. But it's not happening fast enough. And the reason why we're seeing inflation remain so sticky is because of services. And a lot of that's from wage pressures.
Yeah, I think I've from pass through costs, I've heard some people call that bad revenue. It boosts your top line, but take a reputational hit, doesn't really do anything to your bottom line. So, but I think on the other side of that, from what we're seeing, from a consulting perspective, definitely looking at leaders and organizations trying to look at their support model and operation models to kind of see if they can optimize it a little bit more. Obviously, we've been doing that for 20 and 30 years, but I think you have a question later on AI, which we'll get into on that. But so I think that's a big focus as a way to kind of see if they can pull back as much as possible on charging their customers for any sort of inflationary spikes. So and a big piece of that, especially in the banking environment, that's really restrictive on those kind of what I'll call discretionary type of kind of projects. And so you're looking at, they're kind of getting creative in ways how they're kind of proposing their fee structures to us around that kind of sharing in a cost takeout model and kind of almost a profit sharing perspective. So we're definitely seeing folks trying to cut down their costs as much as possible, in this inflationary environment.
So getting to AI or just kind of investment, labor costs obviously are pressure. So there's a lot of answers. Investment is one of them. A lot of investment in the United States right now is being directed by the government through, you can call it industrial policies or incentives or whatever. My question is always, who put the government up to those incentives? How much pressure came from lobbyists, et cetera, to, get these programs? But what is your outlook right now on business investment, the areas that they're interested in? Is it all AI, or is AI just a handful of firms and everybody else is watching from the outside?
Sure. Again, we talk to CEOs and we actually survey them several times a year, and they are invested in growth, right? And the things that they are investing in, yes, technology. Not so much structures, but certainly technology. In particular, they're investing in the adoption of AI. That takes on different forms. Most of it is not necessarily to replace people, but to enhance the people that they have. There's also a lot of investment in human capital, right? So when you think about human capital, it's retraining, upskilling, that sort of thing. And when it comes to companies benefiting from industrial policies, I would say it's a little less sinister. Of course, there's always lobbying, but the thing is that the US is in this, Cold War, if you will, Cold War with China along a number of fronts, including trade, technology, energy products and services, and pushing that forward. Also hard power, which is military power, and soft power. And so the rise in protectionism that kind of started before the pandemic and really intensified is really the genesis, or really the base of the industrial policy drive. But it's not all bad, right? So I heard somebody say, governor from the Bank of Ireland said, "Oh, not all industrial policy is bad." And certainly if you're investing in infrastructure, which we badly so desperately need. And again, it's not so much new infrastructure, there's fixing what's broken. That's still important if you're a business. It means that you don't have to change the tires on your trucks all the time. Your workers might get there on time, right? Because transit's better. And so there are definitely, benefits to infrastructure spending right now. And a lot of companies, especially our companies who are in, basic materials, construction, even like scaffolding, random things, as well as defense, are really benefiting, and they're investing in their own companies so that they can meet this increase in demand for infrastructure building, and also focusing on technology. And that's really benefiting a lot of our companies. And certainly you'll see that in the GDP data. The government contributions to GDP has been pretty significant over the last, basically since those bills were passed in the middle of 2022, except for the first quarter of this year. But also over the longer run, in terms of bolstering total factor productivity. That's a function of a number of things. Yes, your superstar firms, but over the long run, past investments in infrastructure, ongoing investments in CapEx, and ongoing investments in your human capital.
Yeah, and I would just add, kind of taking a little bit of a different position on it, is that we're definitely seeing a breakthrough in AI. And I think a lot of it is, at least from some of the folks I'm talking to, is pent up demand, waiting for the last 20 years to get comfortable enough with this technology to use it. And again, I'm a little bit more skewed towards financial services organizations, but the people we're talking to, they have lists, thousands of use cases long. And they're very excited to kind of see what they can leverage. And some of the things we're hearing from them are kind of bigger chunks to take out, where you're talking like they're looking at to start 2/3 of capacity out of an organization. That's a big chunk, so but I think at the same time too, some of the other organizations, what we're seeing is that, we're kind of that maybe where they're trying to take 2/3 of capacity out of, say, a back office, client service team, researching trade breaks, whatever. But I kind of, on the other hand, I think you're looking at some organizations say that's a tactical use case, and we're not trying to go down that road again where we're kind of band-aiding together all these different solutions like we've done over the last 30, 40 years in financial services. So, you know, we want to create somewhat of an AI organization, not completely removing the idea of a human, because I know there's a lot of people in here that know a lot more about this than me, but like, you know, they want to kind of make it so that you have the nerve center of an organization, and these are existing companies. So, you know, the last speaker's point around how a lot of new organizations, you know, will adopt, you know, the kind of the newest AI technology, and I believe that. But these are some organizations that are really thinking about how they can really kind of re-engineer their existing, you know, operations and have kind of the nerve center be AI. So certainly, you know, a lot of exciting things that we're hearing about. And, you know, we're definitely hearing a lot about it.
So just as an anecdote of how fast this is moving, I live in Memphis, blue suede shoes. And Elon Musk, you might have heard of him. He blew into Memphis 90 days ago and said he wanted to build the world's largest supercomputer in Memphis. Well, we're not exactly a tech center. But what we do have is we have really, really cheap energy, and we have access to all the water on the planet between the Mississippi River and an aquifer that runs underneath the city. And energy, water, transportation, and a willing government were the four conditions they wanted to basically in 90 days bring this project to fruition. And during that time, he raised $6 billion in the equity markets for this project. And then he announced that he was going to redirect hundreds of thousands of NVIDIA chips from Tesla to SpaceX and XAI, which is this new project. The point here being that, you know, it doesn't matter whether I think this is a good idea or not. Elon thinks it's a good idea and he has the money to drive it. And it's taken him 90 days to basically pivot from Tesla's going to have automated driving to, oh, no, wait a minute. I'm going to, you know, build the fastest supercomputer in the world. Blue Oval City is outside of Memphis. That's Ford's big EV project. That's a $4 billion project, 4,000 hires. It's going to take until 2026 to come online. Musk believes he'll be online by 25. Doesn't matter whether you believe in AI. It's there for the place setting, and it's going to leave a mark. Whether it leads to a recession in 25 or 26, I don't know, but it's going to be there for a while.
Can I just add a couple of things?
Sure.
We also asked our executives point blank, what do you think are going to be the benefits of AI? And overwhelmingly, they all said, yes, we're going to adopt it. We think it's going to be great for increasing productivity of our workers, of our industry. We think it's going to increase collaboration and employee engagement. We even think it's going to bolster our profits, like 62% of them said that. And then, you know, there were also some negative things, but most of it was like, yeah, we are going to have to invest in this. We're going to have to spend money in the technology. We're going to change our business models to accommodate this. And there was very little concern about, you know, regulation being an obstacle. I mean, right now there really isn't any regulation on AI. It'll come. But, you know, they were overwhelmingly optimistic. And when it came to replacing workers, they were like 52% said it. So that, well, it might not, right? So that means most of them, at least slightly more than half, don't really think that it's going to replace labor. In fact, a lot of companies are looking at accessible forms of AI. I'm saying that because AI has been around for 60 years in one format or another, but like accessible, probably since December 2022. They're saying that, you know, again, they think this is going to be great. And most likely, you know, they're also thinking about it as a way to address labor shortages, right? So a lot of companies, especially in leisure and hospitality, government, healthcare, you know, certain occupations within those areas are ripe for using AI to make up for the fact that you don't have workers. And so, at least for the bigger companies, they're really optimistic about AI.
Yeah, and I would just add to, like, you know, when you drop the business case initially, you're finding out what type of capacity gains you're going to get. You know, what really happens at the end probably isn't really what was on paper in the beginning. So sadly, but you know, that's the reality of the situation. So.
Well, at least they're willing to take the deep dive,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Well, then, another item, because Rajiv brought this up to me when we were speaking this weekend. Part of the reason Memphis got it is because it has cheap power. Well, they shop this around, and in places like Atlanta, they've already given away all the cheap power to data centers, which are the competitor. So I mean, there are bottlenecks in this process that will limit how fast it can develop or where it goes. So it's, as an economist, it's a very interesting, watching it work through the system. And I don't have to wait 4 years to watch it work through the system. It'll be there very quickly. This is an important election year. We've had some very interesting elections recently. In Mexico, a socialist was replacing a socialist, and the stock market didn't like it. Then in India, a nationalist was kind of defeated and still in power, and the market didn't like it. And in Europe, we had the basically incumbents everywhere being wiped out, and the market didn't like it. So we've had this string of elections. It doesn't really matter, the question is more pro-business than the political outcome. But I hear there's an election here on November 5th. So not just in the United States, but globally, politics runs into a lot of issues. I want to kind of go through them in an order. The first being kind of, because we talked about just saying a regulatory, green, the whole kind of, the changing metrics from climate change and those things. How are those bearing on corporate policies, corporate strategy?
Sure. So the companies we speak with are very concerned about, elections in general. Like roughly half the global population, over 4 billion people, are participating in some election somewhere. And we've seen a lot of big changes through those elections. And certainly that's creating a lot of uncertainty, especially in the United States, because of regulatory issues, but also taxes, as Holly mentioned, the jobs cuts and I can't remember what it's called. Wait, the jobs and 27
Jobs Act.
What'd you say?
Tax
Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, expires in 2025 in terms, not all of it. So the corporate rate's still going to remain 21%, but the individual tax cuts are going to go away, and also a lot of the kind of special corporate and also, people who are like LLCs, they're their own business. Some of those tax cuts are going to go away. So there's a lot of concern about taxes, regulation, but there's also a lot of concern about trade policy. A lot of the companies that we have relationships with, again, are like the biggest companies on the planet, and they are very vulnerable to supply chains. Everything from computer chips to food, to metals, all these things. And they're very worried that we're going to see, either more regulation with one administration, or, no commitment to, keeping taxes low from one administration, from a different administration. I can't use names. Doubling down on trade wars that are going to disrupt supply chains and raise costs that way. And there's also, big concerns from a number of our businesses that, certain aspects of the IRL. I can't remember any of these things, but basically the Inflation Reduction Act will go away, and embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are a lot of supports for greening, right? So there are tons of our industries who are like, yay, we can play in this space. But on the other hand, some of our industry members are like, yes, more industrial policies, because companies are coming back, factories are coming back. We get to build them. We get to supply our raw materials for them. The utilities companies are really concerned, especially about AI and the fact that they have to supply energy and water for cooling for these giant centers. So on the one hand, we're advancing technologically, but we don't necessarily have the resources to accommodate it, or use up a lot of resources. So they're just really concerned. And they're also concerned about how engaged the US is going to be in the global economy. So with one administration, we may see a reduction of engagement and leadership of the US in the global economy. And then you kind of have, China, Russia, the BRICS, expanded BRICS kind of gathering more influence throughout the world. So those are the things that I think, many of our folks are worried about. And for some of them, they're kind of holding their breath. They're not investing, right? Because they don't want to commit to some long-term project that's tied to some policy that's going to be repealed in some way. So, that's really a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, and I think from a business strategy perspective, certainly, in the financial services world, the regulatory landscape will change with the change in administration. And you kind of saw with the previous administration, a more lax take on, how they regulate big banking organizations or small banking organizations. And I think, after the fall of Silicon Valley Bank, there is certainly all eyes are focused on our regional banking system in the US, super regional banks, and really about, what those asset thresholds are for enhanced prudential standards and what that means in, in financial services world is, how often you're getting, an exam from the Fed. Are you doing stress testing? What type of, capital are you holding against your assets on your balance sheet, things like that. So, I think regardless of administration change, there will be a kind of probably a re-strategy on that from the regulators. And then on the green front, I think, I would say that more controversial than the IRA is probably the SEC's Climate Disclosure Act rule. So, and that's already under an administrative stay because it's got so many lawsuits against it. So, but I would say that from a business strategy perspective, a lot of the organizations, at least in the US, that are looked at as kind of capital providers and enablers of those big fossil fuel companies generating emissions, they're already kind of taking the steps to find ways to at least disclose in a standardized way about what they're doing and who they're lending capital to, or from an asset manager like BlackRock or something, where they're kind of they're investing their money, things like that. So from a what happens if there's a change of administration with on the green and sustainability front, I think the big people that are really moving the needle are still making they're still going forward with their initial strategy from 3 years ago, coming out of COP26 when ESG was really hot, everybody was making commitments together, and everybody was aligned to the 2050 scenario. So I still see that going on with some of the bigger organizations, and obviously the smaller organizations that are going to have less resources to do it voluntarily. You'll probably see a lag there if the SEC doesn't push that rule across, and likewise with the IRA. I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens coming to the next administration on that.
So just zeroing in on a couple of things that we talked about in the preparation. Global minimum tax, which is one of the things that's under discussion. Governor McLuhan, that'd be of interest to Ireland. That was one that's passed about. Is that high on the priority list, or is that just kind of out there?
It is, especially for our CFOs. I was at a meeting of our CFO 250 groups of Fortune 250, and they brought that up. And it was kind of dormant for a while, but now that it's gaining a lot of traction throughout the world, especially in Europe, that we're like, yeah, what does this mean for us? So we have to pay taxes twice, So yes, it's definitely an issue.
Yeah, and well, in terms of tax cuts generally, I think it's more savings, better for the economy. But kind of on the corporate side of it, if talking to a few kind of executives, in the financial services world, and what keeps them up at night, it's a failed treasury auction or a default on US debt. That's what they're all worried about. And it kind of brings me back to a point on like resiliency and economic resiliency, and like not even in the kind of private sector, but in the public sector within the US. What happens, all these tax cuts will eventually have an impact on our deficit, the debt ceiling, potential government related government shutdowns. And So what that means for firms and their strategy is, it means a lot more work, you know, they're spending a lot more time realigning resources to think about, you know, how their own organization is gonna be resilient against something like that. So, you know, we see a lot of our clients, you know, having to, you know, divert resources whenever there's a potential government shutdown, or, you know, there's deficit is looming, you know, and you know, they're you know, putting together all these playbooks, and you know, so it's got a trickle down effect there that I think, and obviously resilience is a big kind of topic in the private sector, obviously because of cyber related risks, but I think you can also see that kind of the economic resilience kind of, you know, trickling down from things that, you know, policy related decisions like that.
So let me ask the nasty question, because I'm a China expert. I haven't been to China since COVID, and the reality is I may never go back to China because they're making it very difficult for people who are not Chinese to do business in China. But there is a lot of business in China. And I always tell people, you can't look at the US or even the US-Europe Chinese relationship like the United States and the Soviet Union, because those two didn't do any business with each other. But this is much more like the big three against the UAW, where they live in the same world and they fight about carving it up between each other, and they don't like each other, but they need each other. China, you know, regardless of president, it looks like tariffs are going up against China. Maybe tariffs are going up against other people. What are firms thinking about this? What are the strategies for, you know, next year, 5 years, 10 years? Does everyone move to India? Does everyone move to, you know, someplace? What's the next place, et cetera? I mean, that's, what are you guys hearing?
Sure, so the firms we speak with are doing many things. So some of them are building China for China and then everybody else, right? So basically they're kind of ring fencing their China business to building out supply chains within China, right, to service the Chinese customer. And then they have, you know, basically the rest of the world. And they're bifurcated, so that if something goes wrong, you know, the US-China tensions rise, for whatever reason, a variety of reasons, they can kind of isolate themselves because they really were, many businesses were very negatively impacted by, you know, Russia's war in Ukraine, where all of a sudden, you know, their assets were seized or rendered null, you know, or they just had to get up and run away, and they lost a lot. So they're trying to build out an infrastructure in China. A lot of other, also some of our companies are, you know, exiting China, and they're going to ASEAN economies, or looking at India also, and they're also looking at our USMCA partners, mainly Mexico, as alternatives. And then some of our companies are bringing their factories back to the US, which is creating, you know, issues in terms of labor shortages in manufacturing and raising costs and all that stuff. Like, deglobalization is expensive. So they're doing a lot of different things depending upon who they are, but there's not this broad exit from China like you might think. They're just trying to ring fence it so that they can still access that market, but protect themselves in case something goes terribly wrong.
Yeah, I agree. You know, probably the only thing I'd add is just that it just, you know, with you know, these policy decisions around tariffs and, you know, what you previously mentioned, the tax cuts, we're already at a pretty fragile existence, you know, in our geopolitical economy, and there's a lot of weight on it right now, you know, going to my point earlier about, you know, US default on debt or failed auction, you know, our relationship with China, and, you know, putting more weight, more stress on that. It just puts a lot of risk on, I think, and, you know, again, going back to the whole resiliency of it all is, you know, how are we building resilience into it? What are we thinking about if something does go wrong, you know? And so, like, that's probably where I think was most important to be thinking about is, you know, with taking the steps and planning it out to think about what would we do if something like that happened, where there would be a split, you know? That wasn't planned, I should say.
We've got about 15 minutes between us and lunch, so I've got a hard stop at noon. So let me take questions from the audience. Kathleen?
Thank you very much. So I'd like to go back to the first segment of your comments, namely that corporations are zeroing in on cutting costs, so cost compression. Tie that in with Rajiv's comment about the fact that the labor market is bifurcated. And, you know, coming back, circling back and looking at how the CEO pay checks have increased dramatically. And you mentioned Elon Musk, for example. Do you think, are you worried that this two-tier kind of structure in terms of compensation can create a major backlash?
So I actually have a slightly different view from Rajiv in terms of the labor market. So post-pandemic, I see the labor market in three buckets. You have the former pandemic darlings, you have the labor shortage sufferers, and you have everything in the middle. So if you look at, non-farm payrolls over the last year and a half, most of the job gains have been in those sectors that are still suffering from significant labor shortages. Yes, a lot of them are in sectors where people don't make that much money, but guess what? That's where the demand for jobs are, but there's just not enough supply because a lot of those jobs are dirty, you have to show up to work physically, they're strenuous, you have to deal with the population. Meanwhile, those sectors are losing people to retirement, as well as people not really wanting to go in those sectors. So that's why wages are still rising. If you look at wages, you break it up into goods versus services. So goods wage growth is still running off the races. Services inflation has slowed, but it's still much higher than what we saw. So that's the labor shortage group. And guess what? Labor shortages are not going away because we're still going to have many people retiring. And also when you look at the trades, the average person in the trade groups is much older and they're looking at retirement. Meanwhile, young people aren't incentivized to go into those areas. You're always going to need electricians, plumbers, construction workers, etc. So that's one bucket. And then you have the other bucket, which I mentioned are the former pandemic darlings. Those were the sectors that hired a lot of people because there was significant demand. So that included anyone who was manufacturing goods, technology, finance. Remember every interest rates collapsed and everybody was on, what was that, Robinhood? That was a really great time for finance. And now the interest rates are where they are, the highest we've seen in, 20 years, maybe more. That's not a good environment for the financial sector. So they're right sizing. And unfortunately, yeah, they are laying off people 45 and older who are expensive. So you have those folks, you have transportation and warehousing. Why that? Because they were moving all the goods that people, you're not going to buy like 5 cars and 100 lawn chairs. You're just not going to do that. If you didn't buy it, you're just not going to buy it anymore, right? And so those are the areas that are really suffering. Also residential construction. Why? Interest rates rose, so the mortgage rates, demand collapsed, right? So residential construction is not doing well. Non-residential, great, awesome, infrastructure, wonderful. So you have a lot of these sectors that have to right size, and also technology. They've hired tons of people. They probably overhired. If you look at the level of people in all the industries that you would call tech, it's not one technical, you gotta pick them out. They were significantly above their average, right? And so they're just kind of getting back to that. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are folks that make a lot of money. So it does look like this, white collar recession, but it's really about the industry itself. And also the tech industry uses a lot of debt, right? So all of a sudden the cost of capital is super expensive. So you gotta cut somewhere, and it's we're gonna right size. And unfortunately, it's like, well, the folks who don't have experience in AI or super expensive, the middle managers. So that's how I look at that. So you have these 1 and 2, and then you have 3 in the middle, which is a lot. And those companies are not hiring anyone, right? They're holding on to whatever they have And they're saying, well, we're not really sure about what the outlook's gonna look like. Last year, they were concerned about recession. This year, they're concerned about elections and geopolitics. So they're just holding on to what they have. And so that's why temporary employment has been negative over the last 2 years, because if you're a company and you're not hiring anybody because you're like, well, we're good right here, you don't need temps. And unfortunately, some of our clients are like the biggest tech companies, services companies on the planet, and they're just like, oh, they're awful for us. Like, I'm sorry, but nobody wants you. So that's what's going on there. But for the most part, you have a lot of companies that are just kind of sitting tight. So that's why I don't see it as like white collar, blue collar. It's very specific to industry, but also, there's some occupational issues there as well. Now, if there's going to be a backlash, I don't think so, because you have all these, the whole middle that people are working. The unemployment rate is super low in the US. Maybe it might rise a little bit, 4.25%, but we're not going to 5-6% unemployment. And when we look at our consumer confidence measure, as opposed to University of Michigan, we ask about the labor market in our headline. And the reason why it has not collapsed is because people are working. And guess what? Many of them have seen wage increases, especially people at the lower end of the income spectrum. That's what you have to worry about. If you have a lot of people who are poor, they're not seeing their wages rise and inflation's up the wazoo, that's when you start seeing, real backlash. But again, even though the same people complain about the price level of inflation, they're saying eggs are $8, they used to be $2. Even though the rate of increase in egg prices has slowed, eggs are still $8, bread's $10, right? And that upsets them. But for some reason, they're not flipping out because they are working. So I don't necessarily see this big backlash coming over the labor market. There could be definitely a backlash over prices, because inflation and prices impact everyone. Long answer, I'm sorry.
Brandon, anything? No?
Yeah, that was it.
Yes.
Yeah, among the conference board consumer expectations, it's still pretty low and has come down fairly hard over the last two years or so. Do you attribute that all to inflation, or why is consumer confidence also quite low in the conference board data as well?
So our headline measure is actually pretty high relative to history. But yes, we have two pieces. There's current conditions and expectations. And what's been holding up the headline is the present situation. And the present situation is broken down into what you think about business conditions and labor market conditions. So they're saying, yes, labor market's great, business conditions went from being very negative to slightly less negative. The expectations gauge, yes, has slowed and it's kind of danced around 80. 80 is that threshold where, typically in the past, it's forecasted a recession. Now, the reason why we didn't get a recession last year is because companies didn't let folks go, right? That's a change of behavior, structural change, again, due to the fact that we have an aging population. But yes, the expectations measure is made up of 3 components. When you think about business conditions in the future, what you think about employment in the future, and what you think about incomes in the future. And at least 2 out of the 3 have definitely weakened. So employment and business conditions. But the income, they're still like, well, I guess I'll be okay. But that's what's driving the measure down. Now, we do ask about inflation and we ask about recession. They're separate questions that are not in the headline. So the recession question, we've only had it for like 2.5 years, peaked around this time last year. And then it's come off. But then in the last 2 months, it's kind of ticked up a little bit. People are getting concerned that, maybe not recession, but something that, slowdown is going to happen. And we do think there's going to be a slowdown. It's already happening. First quarter GDP was 1.3%. Second and third quarter is probably somewhere between 0 and 1%. And we also ask questions about inflation. We ask for write-ins about inflation. And the biggest write-in is that prices are too high. They're not complaining as much about the change in prices, which is inflation, but they're saying everything costs too much. Oh, and also interest rates are too high. We can't buy anything that's expensive. And oh, by the way, car insurance and home insurance is really elevated. So they're complaining about a lot of these things, but it's not in the headline. So that's why I say consumers have mixed feelings. They're telling us, hey, you know, we don't like prices being high or elevated interest rates, but we are working and we are having income and our finances are okay. So that's keeping our measure from collapsing like the University of Michigan's did. Sure.
I'm being warned from the back of the room by the master of ceremonies. Well, lunch is approaching, so before we get into another question,
Yes.
I'd like to thank this panel.
Yes.
Lauren will tell us where to go.
Yes, exactly. We have lots for you. It's across the elevators. And I would like to let you know that at 2 o'clock we start again with President Parker being a keynote.
1 o'clock.
2 o'clock. 1 o'clock. 1 hour. 1 o'clock. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the lunch. And we appreciate the hospitality of the Federal Reserve Bank here in Philadelphia. It's a distinct honor and pleasure to introduce a great colleague, I would say, from the past, the president of the Philly Fed, Patrick Harker, who serves as a president since 2015. He's an engineer by training, a true academic that progressively not only he made contributions to the literature, but at the same time he was a great leader, moving from the dean of Wharton Business School to being the president of University of Delaware prior to joining in 2015 the leadership role here at the Philly Fed. And one very characteristic of his progression in terms of his career was every time when he was moving to a different position, somehow his income was coming down, suggesting that he really wanted to contain inflation. And I hope he will be able to do so here in our district in a great way. But seriously, he has made so many contributions to academic literature, 10 books, 100 articles or so, many great things that happened during his leadership at the university. I'm not going to say the words, that we know next door to Drexel, but especially University of Delaware, and then coming here, wonderful economic development in our district, new initiatives, and great thought leadership. And I don't want to go on and on. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, my old friend. We go back a long way, so it's been great to see you here today. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you once again here at the Global Interdependence Center at Philly Fed. It's particularly my pleasure to welcome Central Bank of Ireland Governor Gabrielle. Thank you so much for visiting. Your first time here in Philadelphia, right? So that's great. And in so doing, as I welcome you, I have to acknowledge a figure who stands right in the middle, right in the center of the histories of the central bank of both of our countries, the economist Henry Parker Willis. Parker Willis was one of the main architects of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Subsequently served as both the first secretary of the Federal Reserve Board, as well as the Federal Reserve System's Director of Research from 1918 to 1922. And then in 1926, as the then 4-year-old Irish Free State grappled with the question of how to set up its own independent currency system, it enlisted Henry Parker Willis to lead that effort. His experience and expertise directly influenced the Irish Currency Act of 1927. And then over the past century, Ireland and the United States enjoyed a strong, friendly, and I think deeply beneficial relationship. And as our history surely predates Irish independence to the ancestors of today's millions of Americans, you still see that tie way back when. As an individual, as an Irish American myself, I'm proud of this history. As a central banker, I'm also proud of knowing that this history extends to our financial underpinnings as well. So again, welcome. Now, before I get to the topic at hand, before I moderate a discussion, allow me to do what do away with a bit of official business. You know it, by noting that the views I express are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else in the Federal Reserve System or on the Federal Open Market Committee. Done. Pat, you can say Pat said, you can't say the Fed said. So let's get into the afternoon, the program here this afternoon. Let me start with my view of current economic conditions. So allow me to open with 4 brief statements. First, high inflation remains not only a leading concern of many Americans, but also it's a central concern of mine and my colleagues. Second, the overall underpinnings of the American economy have proven nothing less than resilient, time and time again, despite the high rates leaning against aggregate demand for more than a year now. Third, monetary policy overall remains positioned in restricted territory to bring inflation back to its 2% target, while minimizing broader economic risks. And fourth, we are still surrounded by an air soaked with uncertainty. It's a soaked with uncertainty. There are a host of risks and known unknowns. But what I would like to emphasize is that the data haven't so far resolved those. Indeed, data have been what I would describe as choppy. Not that that is unheard of. As the economy becomes more and more balanced, the chances of a miss on the upside or the downside are roughly evenly distributed. But the point stands. The data have not quite dissipated this uncertainty as I would have hoped they would have. Well, then I should add a fifth to my list of 4. More data is essential, absolutely essential. Let's turn to inflation. With regard to inflation, as we all saw, the promising disinflation of the second half of 2023 unceremoniously halted through the first quarter of 2024. Now, I had expected bumps in the road, but the Q1 2024 bump threatened to become a hill climb. Yet, while the lack of progress toward the inflation target was concerning, inflation did not reignite. And while I remain very attentive to inflation risks, the latest inflation data have been quite promising that progress on disinflation has resumed. But, and I want to emphasize this, but promising fails short of the confidence I want to have before cutting rates, that inflation is on a sustainable path back to target. Now, look, inflation has a range of impacts throughout the economy, but its greatest impact is on low and moderate income families. Those who have already been pinching their pennies over the past 2 years and aren't sure how much more they can pinch. The situation has been made much worse as inflation hit hard the basic necessities, shelter, food, transportation. Fortunately, we have seen quite a bit of improvement in many categories. Food prices have been essentially flat for several months now. Gas prices came down sharply in 2023. Vehicles, new and used, are cheaper now than a year ago. Unfortunately, the long-term stubbornness of shelter inflation especially remains a concern, along with the continually high rate of inflation in the services sector, notably auto insurance and repairs. Echoes of the past run-up in vehicle prices, most likely. Last week's CPI inflation release for May was very welcome, and the kind of price data I want to see, and I think we all want to see more. But I would add the caveat that our inflation target is the PCE price index, not the CPI, the May reading of which is not due for another 11 days. If the higher inflation in the first quarter was a bump on the road, I want to make sure that the lower inflation we are seeing so far in the second quarter is not a pothole. So I remain focused on seeing inflation return to a clear path and return to that path toward our target of 2% annually. So overall, there's much in the American economy that allows me to be optimistic. Unemployment remains low, job creation appears robust, and labor market participation is within range of its historic levels. So the labor market remains healthy, while supply and demand are coming into better balance, as shown by the average number of job openings to job seekers, as well as other measures of labor market tightness, like quits and job-to-job transitions. both of which are generally normalized. Gross domestic product, while leveling off in the first quarter from the close of 2023, continues to grow. We have seen some moderation in consumer spending as of late, and I am keeping a close eye, very close eye on household finances. All said, and as a recent Fed survey shows, overall measurement of economic well-being among American households remains essentially unchanged from 2022. The percentage of respondents saying they were, quote, doing at least okay financially, end quote, in 2023 was roughly where it was the prior year, for example. And economic resilience is measured by a respondent's ability to afford, say, a $400 emergency expense. That similarly remained unchanged. Yet inflation continues to eat away at the sense of true economic well-being. More respondents said their expenses increased than their incomes increased. And I should add, these results are in line with what I hear as I'm out and about when I speak to residents and contacts across the 3rd district. This is a strong convergence of the soft data, the hard data. So to me, the key is wrestling inflation back down to target. And in this, progress has been uneven. Inflation is way down from where it was a year ago, but with the high inflation readings between January and March factored in, progress in recent months has been modest. So I believe that the current policy interest rate, which has been held steady for nearly 11 months, will continue to serve us well for a bit longer, holding us in restrictive territory to bring inflation back to target and to mitigate those upside risks. So over the ensuing months, I'll continue to closely monitor the data, both hard and soft, on inflation, labor markets, and economic activity. And I will be asking whether it is or is not the right time to decrease the policy. When that time will be exactly, I just don't know it. I have a forecast for inflation, employment, and economic activity, slowing but above trend growth, a modest rise in the unemployment rate, and a long glide back to target for inflation. If all of that happens to be as forecasted, I think one rate cut could be appropriate by year end, as well as a medal for myself for being the best economic forecaster ever. Because look, any forecast remains just that. It's a forecast. I think this is important to emphasize. It's a forecast. It is not a lockdown commitment. My commitment is to remain data dependent because this is how we get through this uncertainty and make sure inflation returns to target sustainably. Indeed, I see 2 cuts or none for this year is quite possible if the data break one way or another. So again, we need to remain data dependent. We need to let this data play out. And this is a time when the independence of the Federal Reserve System and beyond that to other central banks will be of utmost importance. Look, this is a fraught time in our nation and in the world, which makes it all the more vital that we as central bankers remain not nonpartisan, but apolitical. We at the Fed operate under our dual mandate to ensure price stability and maximum employment for the American people. This is our mandate given by the US Congress, and it is our goal. To achieve this, we must make decisions by looking at all the data, not just a narrow set, and by asking and answering the right questions. And that statement brings me to my final thoughts this year. How do we ensure we're asking the right questions to begin with? I say with great pride that the research team here at the Philly Fed is filled with some of the brightest economic minds available. I know that's the same for our team in Washington and our sister banks across the Federal Reserve System. We have a world-class group of economists. Now, one of the things I like doing, being the old college professor, is going out and talking to students. So whenever I speak to students studying economics, I'm quick to note that the Federal Reserve System is the largest employer of economists in the nation. I want these future economists to consider us as a potential career choice. And I'm not just a central banker. At that moment, I'm also a recruiter. I'm looking for talent. Recently, I've been pleased to see that the makeup of these student audiences has become somewhat more diverse over time. But honestly, it's still not nearly as representative as we all want. To me, the next generation of economists isn't just important because they're the ones who will sit at the desks of those who have gone on to retirement or other aspects of the field. What's more important are the perspectives they bring into these future positions. And we need voices that are not going to be afraid to challenge us and to look at these old numbers with new eyes. To foster this, Philadelphia Fed has partnered with the National Association for Business Economics, or NABE, in an effort to bring more historically underrepresented individuals into the field of economics. But to be sure, we are not the only ones who have recognized the vital need for diversity, not just in economic thinking, but in economic thinkers. The simple reality is that the underrepresentation of women and minority economic students at the college and university levels ultimately leads to an underrepresentation at the professional level. Nearly a decade ago, 2016, Amanda Baer and Cecilia Ellen Relson's article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives noted the lack of diversity within the field of economics, quote, hampers the discipline, constraining the range of issues addressed and limiting our collective ability to understand familiar issues from new and innovative perspectives. That concern was underscored by research released by the Fed in 2017. That research measured student diversity in economics programs through the attainment of bachelor's degrees at hundreds of colleges and universities across the United States. It was a project that captured the annual makeup of classes from 2011 to 2015, with a yearly average of nearly 35,000 economics students. Overwhelmingly, the data showed that the presence of women and underrepresented minorities lagged well behind that of white males. Now, there are certainly many reasons why students may not choose to study economics. Perhaps the discipline's moniker, statistical science, may hamper recruitment. But as we know here, economics is far more than just guns and butter. They're able to define cost, opportunity costs, and mutual exclusivity, or understanding, let alone grasping, the minutiae of monetary policy. It's much more than that. So much of our world, and nearly every decision made by individuals and governments, whether they recognize it or not, is an economic decision at its heart. Everything from the goods they purchase to the jobs they take, whether or not to go to school to study, say, economics. The homogeneity in the economics discipline prevents us from being able to more fully investigate those decisions, to more fully understand choices and trade-offs, and to move economics forward in a more meaningful way that captures the nuances of rapidly changing economies and societies. Even 1 year ago, Fanny Paredes Fuentes and Tim Burnett in the London School of Economics blog post wrote, diversity among economists is crucial for policy, as it enables the inclusion of a wide range of perspectives and experiences, leading to more informed and effective decision-making. That goes, I mean, think about this. This goes far beyond an ability to understand hard data. We can take all the classes we want and become proficient in collecting hard data and making calculations that seek to understand decisions and influence policy. But the hard data can only take researchers so far. Equally important is what we call the soft data. And there is no soft data that can be more important, in my mind, than a lived experience. Or, as Anna Stensberg in Harvard Business Review succinctly asked in 2022, without many economists from less socio-economically advantaged backgrounds, what kind of perspectives, questions, and answers are we missing? So for here at the Philly Fed, and all of us here at the Philly Fed, we know that increasing the diversity of those studying and practicing economics isn't just good for ensuring that our workplaces were reflective of the world outside these walls, but it's crucial to ensuring that the work we produce is more reflective and therefore better as well. I think it's vital as well to the reputation of that work. In the words of that most preeminent of Philadelphians, Benjamin Franklin, glass, china, and reputation, all are easily cracked and never well mended. So my hope is for everyone here today to likewise commit to ensuring that the reputation of economics discipline does not crack. So I ask you to commit to ensuring economics remains relevant in the lives of those we aim to support through our work. I encourage you, if you've not already done so, find local partners, whether it be directly with an institution of higher education or a business association. Seek out and foster economists of tomorrow. Those economists, after all, are the ones who will eventually be sitting and standing where we are today. And we are going to want them to look back at this convening and build upon our work and our progress, not only because we have all the answers, because we recognize that we don't, and that many questions are yet to be asked. With that, let me close with my prepared remarks. Thanks again. I think George is coming back up. We're going to have a conversation.
Can be here. There's a boss here. But such a pleasure seeing you, but at the same time, listening to the remarks in education. You call for diversity in economics. We understand it. And universities try to do a lot of different things. Right. So you've been in academic administration for so many years prior to your position here. Right. Where do you think we should start from? Because as you know, there are serious time lags from the time you intervene to the time that you can see the labor force adjust to the diversity kind of issue. So what's your opinion?
Yeah, first, is this on? Okay, good. Yes. You know, some would argue that there's an active debate, right? Some would argue you start at the high school level, middle school level. I actually support financial literacy programs. In fact, we here at the Philly Fed a very active program in economic education, where we train high school teachers, in some cases middle school teachers, because it's a critical skill in our society, our modern society, to understand some fundamentals of economics. So that's true, but you can't solve the whole world at once, right? So those things have to happen. But you also understand that public school systems are under a lot of budget pressure and so forth. It's very difficult for them to add one more. We found that true, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it's important. When it comes to colleges and universities, we have many students go into intro econ, and then they don't take the next course, right? And so you have to ask yourself why, and there's no one answer to that. In some cases, it's they can't see themselves in that role. Some cases, it's the questions I'm interested in and not the questions that are being presented in the class, right? So some may have to do with how we teach the basic courses. But even beyond the basic courses, it's then how do you mentor that next student? And this is what we're trying to partner with NABE on. If you look at other professions, take my old profession, engineering has done a terrific job working hard to increase the diversity. I'll take one example. The Society of Black Engineers was started by two Purdue students way back when. They said, we feel alone. We need to build up more African American students who are studying engineering to support each other. This is now a nationwide effort, major program in colleges and universities all across the country. Really help, and there's an equivalent group for Latino students, for women engineers. You can go down the list. We really don't have the equivalent in economics as a profession. And that's what we're trying to at least start with NABE.
Indeed, there are some initiatives actually across different universities.
Yeah.
This kind of.
But in terms of a nationwide effort, no, you think about the Society of Black Engineers, it grew from those two students to this incredible national resource.
Yes. Thank you. And switching now on interest rates, that favorable topic. Interest rates for this cycle has been
sticky, I would say, that high enough. So if you look on other cycles, interest rates always have the corrective kind of impact on the economy. What is your thought about the level of interest rates and the cycle in which we go through vis-a-vis the previous cycles?
So let me again reiterate where I am. I think we are in a restrictive stance right now. And we get more restrictive as inflation comes down, obviously. And I'm not, so I am perfectly fine right now with sitting where we are and seeing how the data evolve. Again, as I said, I have in my forecast right now, one rate cut in the latter part of the year. But again, that could change depending on how the data change. You know, we spend a lot of time, both the team here in Philadelphia, really across the system, looking at prior experience. If you'd like to say you can learn from, and you can always learn from history, but this time was, and we hate to say this time it's different, right? That's a dangerous thing to say. But the confluence of factors that hit us during the pandemic, we just hadn't seen. So people will go back to pick your favorite period. Those factors were not there. I mean, for example, just take the supply chain issues. We hadn't seen that before in a significant way in the post-war economy experience. So while we can learn some from those, they don't map over one-to-one very neatly to the current situation. And so, you know, the combination of supply chain factors, the fiscal response, we can go down we know the list of things that affected the economy. And some of those are still there. They haven't just disappeared. Some of the fiscal stimulus is still there. I mean, particularly if you look at state and local governments hiring, a lot of the infrastructure money coming in, there's a lot of spending that's still flowing through the system as part of that fiscal package. So I think at this point, yeah, we can look at those prior experiences, but we also have to read the data today very carefully. So the data today say, as you said, inflation has remained sticky. It isn't coming down, but slowly. And again, if you parse that out, then what is really driving inflation? It's not goods inflation. Right? It's services ex housing and housing. Right? Those are the two that are driving inflation. And services ex housing is strongly correlated with wages of time, right? Restaurants and hospitality. Shelter is the one that's been a head scratcher, right? For I think most people, it's been one where we know where it's headed. I mean, it's pretty clear we know where it's headed. It's just taking longer than I had anticipated. Now, what's happening is, take this city, for example, we're bringing on tens of thousands of multifamily health onto the market. And we're seeing this in other markets across the country. So you would expect, as we're starting to see here, rent's starting to come down. So if you look at, pick your favorite real-time rent index, they are starting to come down. It's the single family. Some of that may be the lock-in effect. Mortgages, some may be the lack of supply generally. We're not building that. Look, before the pandemic hit, we were what, 2 million-ish units shy in housing in America. We haven't made the situation better, and, you know, post-pandemic. So we still have, and we have a particular problem with affordable housing in this country. I mean, a real, in certain markets, a real crisis, you could say, where people just can't live anywhere near the place where they're employed.
Is there any concern about potential disinflation as we move forward? And what kind of data would you like to see before you consider a rate cut?
So there are a host of, I don't like just looking at headline or core numbers because they're just aggregates of what's going on, the underlying data. I actually like looking at the distribution of goods and services, seeing how many are above X percent. Start to think about how's that distribution growing or shrinking. If there's a mistake I made is And we saw it pretty early on here in Philadelphia when we started to believe that we had to take rates up. Is that it went beyond, just remember the days of just saying it was used car prices and other things? Well, as you start to look at that data and see how many goods and services across the economy were seeing inflation that was rising significantly. That started to give us concern that we needed to start raising rates. So we were early on in that. At this point, we're continuing to watch that. I mean, the goods part, we're pretty clear with that. But then there are these issues, like I just mentioned in my prepared remarks, auto insurance. If you asked somebody a year ago, would auto insurance rates be going up like this? Most people would put that at the top of this, but it makes sense. Cars are more expensive, they're more expensive to repair, so the rates go up. So you're seeing that. Now, that could be just a level shift. But we'll see. So these things keep coming, but generally things are moving in the right direction. It's just the speed of it. It's like, but it's very mechanical. We know where shelter inflation is. And it's just taking more time than we anticipated. I anticipate.
But let's be optimistic. Let's assume that will be acceleration of this kind of years. What will it take for the economy to take 3 rate cuts?
You can't just go back to our goal man. It is a goal man, right? So we're ultimately balancing off inflation risk and risk to the labor. Most of the time, those two are complementary, right? They're moving similar. But there are times when it's not true throughout this, and they're the most challenging times. At this point, labor market is starting to cool. We're seeing this, like when we do surveys, like our manufacturing business outlook survey, our non-manufacturing business outlook survey, other surveys people do. The top of the list, I was just talking to people, I'm out and about. Top of the list was labor. Couldn't find the people, couldn't find people. It's just not at the top of the list. It's up on the list, don't get me wrong, but it's not at the top. It's more at the top of the list of things like cost of capital and uncertainty. These are the two I'm hearing: policy uncertainty, uncertainty. They're the two things that business leaders I talk to, nonprofit leaders I talk to, that they're most concerned about. So you have to look at both sets of metrics, not just the inflation numbers, but also the employment numbers. Because what we know, we're really in a risk management stance right now. We're trying to manage bring inflation down. We know that, for example, through history, that when labor markets react, it tends to be very nonlinear. That is, it just we raise rates a little, unemployment goes a little. It doesn't work. There's a nonlinear response to something. We're not near there, in my judgment. We're not even close to that at this point. But that is something you have to watch. Because what I don't want to do is we have a good economy. Now, for those who are struggling, low, moderate income, it really is a tale to economy. You also have to face that. People who are struggling, they're struggling a lot right now. But generally, it's a good economy. So we don't want to risk that while we know inflation is starting to edge down. It's not as fast as we want, but that's the risk trade-off that we have to manage.
So, but also the United States is part of the global world.
Yeah.
And we observe the partners that we have that they cut rates. ECB cut rates.
Right.
This is my favorite question. Why not the Fed?
Look, we all are heading in the same direction. Let's be clear, right? We all are taking rates in a certain direction. It really is just a matter of timing and pace, right? I mean, this is the difference. We're a different economy than European economy. We're a different economy than other economies. And where we stand in terms of our economy, in terms of growth and other things, is different. So why would it be a surprise that our response to that? Right? Why would we think we're gonna all do the same thing? Again, we're all moving. We are all doing the same thing in terms of going down. It's just a question of how quickly.
And the other thing, of course, the spending, consumer spending.
Yeah.
For quite some time has been strong. What do you anticipate?
Now, we've said so many times the consumer is resilient. And generally, that's been very true in America. But this is again where you really need to look at the tail of the economy. For those who have resources, they continue to spend, although it is starting to slow. But for what people have now are calling in the United States the ALICE community, I don't know if you've heard of this acronym before. Asset limited, income constrained. These are people who have a job, but they don't have enough money to make that $400 payment when they blow a tire on their car, right? When they have an emergency, they can't get to work. That community, you're starting to see signs of stress. Default rates are going up on credit cards. Default rates are going up on auto loans. That's a little more complicated situation. You are starting to see the people getting stressed more and more. So that is a concern because that's the community that, and this is where risk management gets real. This is the community that inflation hits the hardest when it hits. And this is the community that loses their jobs first when the economy turns south. That's what we're trying to do.
I want to thank you very much for your
absolutely.
responses, and if you don't mind, I'd like to have a couple of questions from the audience, but before I do that, I would like to publicly acknowledge your support, GIC, and the opportunity that you give us many times to be a keynote speaker.
We're glad you're here. Thank you.
Let's get
Just a quick question. You mentioned rents and housing prices. One of the things I looked at very closely is the impact of the migrant flows.
Yeah.
Across especially regional and local housing markets. You have some places in Texas where the population has doubled and rents and housing prices have gone up. To me, it's not that big of a conundrum if you consider that we've had 12 to 15 million new people. Newcomers come in, that drives up demand for housing and rents. So I keep hearing this from all the different Fed governors that they're puzzled by the fact that rents and housing prices remain high. But as long as we keep bringing people in at, 250, 300, 400,000 a clip, that's gonna create increased demand for housing, because they can't all live in, the 5 hotels in New York City.
Yeah, but, and again, no, I completely agree with you, by the way, but again, and where is that hitting? It's at the affordable level.
That's right, yeah,
Right,
exactly.
it's at the affordable level, and so it's not just the people coming in, that's a big part of it.
Right.
But it's also with the mortgage lock-in effect,
That's right, absolutely.
right? People aren't upgrading,
Yes.
they're not providing the supply of that affordable housing they're currently living in. So you've got multiple factors that are playing out in housing.
But they're not gonna dissipate anything.
No.
Yeah.
David.
Following up on that same topic, I guess. I think the concern is, 20 or 30 years ago, we talked about is dummy or dead situations. I think what's happened with the high interest rates, if you look at the cost of capital, is it impacting two major industries that we haven't discussed yet. Number one is commercial properties and the developers, vacancies and all that kind of stuff. And then the second topic is you're locking people in, empty nesters want to move and downsize to let the next generation come in, the 30-year-olds who are starting families. It's not happening because it's creating lack of mobility, even though there's a desire to downsize. How does the Fed view that? And what is monetary policy? What can the Fed do about it going monetary policy?
So first, from my perspective of monetary policymaker, shelter is really important, but it can't be the only thing that drives the decision. Let's go back to what I started. Groceries, transportation, And there's a host of other things that are vital to people. And so the price of groceries skyrocket. It's now starting to come, like I said, basically been flat. And that's great. So yeah, shelter is a big part of that, but it's not the only thing that should drive. The other thing about housing is, we were talking about this lunch. It's not just interest rates and the cost of capital. It's also zoning restrictions, and there's a host of other things that limit supply. It limited the supply before the pandemic hit, and it continues to limit supply today. So even if you released some of the capital constraints by rates coming down, in certain markets, you wouldn't immediately see a response. Second, the last thing I say is, I think it's really important as you think about the economy and commercial real estate, to not think of it as a homogeneous whole. Very different segments of the market are having very different responses. So obviously downtown office is one, but suburban office is behaving very differently. Data centers are booming. I mean, we can go down the list of all the, so it's because I think we lump everything together and say, well, commercial real estate is an issue. We have to be really careful to parse this and talk segment by segment what's going
on. Great speech. I appreciate that you said, boy, he's a dot. He's the one cut dot. Okay, but that made that very clear. Thank you for that. And then a couple more sentences. Indeed, I see 2 cuts or none. For this year is quite possible. It depends on which way the data breaks. So without giving, I don't expect you to give me exact or give us exact numbers, but okay, 2-part question. First of all, about what level of inflation and kind of inflation decline would get you to say, okay, in next one of the meetings, I'm ready to do a cut, And on the other hand, you don't, and no, hardly anybody does, suggest we could actually be a rate hike in coming months. But I think that's the other part of the question. Again, so what's the metric broadly for when you cut, and what would be the metric? What would you see that would make you say, ooh, I guess maybe we might have to actually hike now? Is there going to be labor market? Is going to be inflation staying stuck at like 2.9%, 2.8% year over year for so long? You say the only way we're going to get to that 2% is actually hiking rates.
The answer is yes, all of the above. You can't look at any one metric. And even if you take a metric, it's really the path of that metric, right? It's the trajectory of that metric. It's not that number in and of itself. Right? We had a good CPI. We'll see what the PCE turns out to be, but there is a correlation too. But that's just 1 month. And if you think about the beginning of the year, we rode through some of those months, and I think it was a good thing because there were voices out there I heard say, well, things got the rates, but then things started to turn the other way. So I think we just need to let this play out. At this point, in my view, this calls for a cautious approach. Let's let several months of data start to create a trajectory that we believe is sustainable. Opposed to chopping, as I said in my comments. And we're still in the chopping. In my mind, we're still in the chopping block. And in which case, I think we sit here. But if we start to see several months where we're seeing data move in the right direction, I could see taking action, but I'm not there.
And you're so patient, you're willing just to wait indefinitely for inflation to come down. I mean, in the next.
No, I mean, at some point, if inflation starts to move in the other direction in a significant way, and is it sustained with, then we'd have to take action. But that is not my forecast. I mean, I think the dynamics for the economy right now, it just doesn't, I mean, there's always that probability, but I don't think it's right now.
More to see. We thank you very much. We appreciate if there are additional questions later on, if you're available. We thank you very much for the insight.
The recording has stopped.
Ladies and gentlemen, we start the next session. Please take your seats. Thank you. And Diana McGinnis will be here with us to moderate this.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Mangus. I am Senior OCIO Investment Advisor with Truist Foundations and Endowment Specialty Practice. So I serve as that outsourced Chief Investment Officer for nonprofit organizations. I'm also happy to say I'm a member of GIC and a member of the Irish American Business Chamber Network. So thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce our two panelists for the afternoon session. We'll have Andre and Zach deliver their prepared remarks first, and then we'll save our questions for when both are done. So we have Andre Kerman, who is Professor of Economics at Drexel's LeBow College of Business. He is Associate Editor at the Journal of Monetary Economics. Andre serves on the Board of Directors at the Philadelphia Federal Statistical Research Data Center. He's a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and his research focuses primarily on the macroeconomics of labor market friction, the measure of firm dynamics, and the business cycle implication of technology and trade shocks. Prior to joining Drexel, Andre worked as a research economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and if Dr. Parker has left, maybe Andre will give us some inside scoop from his experience there. Andre's also served as a visiting associate professor at the finance department of the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, as associate professor of economics at Université de Québec, Montreal. Andre earned his PhD in economics from the University of Virginia, and he holds his bachelor's and master's of economics from the renowned business school HEC University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And I really wanted to spend time unpacking Andre's and Zach's backgrounds just to give you a strong sense of how great this panel is going to be. They are true experts on the topic. Zach Stewart is Director of Talent Acquisition for ICON's North and South America regions. He has been with ICON for 12 years. He currently leads a high-performing global talent acquisition team of 45 professionals, and he is responsible for hiring over 2,000 roles annually across the United States, Canada, and Latin America. Zach is specifically responsible for leading ICON's executive level hiring, and he also manages their HR and talent acquisition operations, specifically in the competitive industry of life sciences and clinical research. And just to give you a sense of who ICON is, ICON PLC was founded in Dublin in 1990 and currently employs over 43,000 people globally as a global provider of consulting and outsourced development services to pharma, biotech, medical device, and public health organizations. And ICON is recognized as one of the world's leading contract research organizations and was named by Forbes as a best large employer in 2024. And I really think we are going to have a fantastic panel thanks to Andre's and Zach's incredible backgrounds on our topic, which is specifically speaking about talent attraction and recruitment and its implications for the economy and possibly monetary policy. So Andre, we'll have you set the table with a big picture view of the labor market, and then Zach will drive it home for us in terms of the trends and challenges in the labor market from the perspective of a large but very focused hiring manager.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Diane, for this very lovely introduction. And I will just say that before I start, I don't hire many people these days. I used to when I was at the Federal Reserve Board in DC just after the financial crisis. I was joking we were the employer of last resort, at least of economists back then, and that was an exciting time. But I leave the the insights of talent attraction and recruitment to Zach, and instead take a little bit more of a macro perspective in the next few minutes. So I want to start with this graph here, which shows job openings relative to total jobs, a data series that comes from a source called Schultz, for those of you who are in the know. And what it shows is that, since the pandemic started, it was a very busy time for recruiters all over. There was a lot of job openings, a lot of companies wanted to hire people, had a lot of recruitment going on. And that number has come down. It stands at 4.8%, which is just slightly higher than before the pandemic. But I'm going to go out here on a limb and I'm going to say that over the next years, it's unlikely to slow down. It may come down more a little bit. It was more around the 3% mark in the 2000s. But I also see big forces that in the future will drive that number up again, because of a lot of occupational shifts that I can see going forward. And in fact, the 4 points I want to make today is first looking back a little bit. Recruitment was tough for the last few years, but it would have been much worse without immigrant labor in the US at least. Occupational transitions that happened and that we have discussed over the last few hours quite a lot. They sparked, that were sparked by the pandemic. They were a big part of the problem of these high recruitment numbers that we've seen. And then looking forward, I see that when I go out on the limb here, that AI will lead to a lot of occupational shifts, disrupt labor markets in ways that we don't quite know yet, obviously, but that will likely lead to a lot of activity on the recruitment front and talent attraction. And how we accommodate this change is going to be really key for productivity growth. A point that has been made by the governor in his early speech, that this is really key. How do we integrate that? And obviously, it's also affect income inequality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these points. First, about immigration. This is a really interesting graph, I think, that came from a economics reporter at the Washington Post, Catherine Rampel, who shows that when you divide employment to when you divide employment into foreign-born versus native-born in the United States, since the pandemic, the employment boom in the United States has been driven primarily by foreign-born labor. Okay, you can see this in the yellow line, which is now 12% higher than prior to the pandemic, where it's normalized to 100%. Whereas for native-born employment, that is essentially just back at the level where we were before. Now, if you're a cynic, and in the current political environment that is highly polarized, there are always a lot of cynics. You could say, well, the immigrant population, they have been stealing away the jobs of the native-born. Right? You could say, well, if that yellow line wasn't that high, then the blue line would be higher. That argument has been made, but I don't think it holds a lot of water, because when you look at the employment to population ratio of these two subgroups, then you see that blue line now, the employment to population ratio of 25 to 54-year-olds, this is sort of prime working age, for native-born is at a record level, right? So the tight labor market has been drawing in a lot of people back into the labor force. Whereas for foreign-born, it's essentially at the pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so what's happening here is what? Why is employment of native-born not higher, but the employment to population ratio is higher on native? It is because there's a lot of people retiring. Okay, so for the United States, which sees low birth rates and a lot of people retiring, it is absolutely key that we have more people who are joining the ranks of the workforce, people who come in from abroad. Okay, that's just, for us to keep the level of the living standards that we would like to have. This is absolutely key, aside from productivity, of course. Okay, so this is the first point. All right, now a little bit about economic occupational transitions that were sparked by the pandemic. Okay, so as we all know, employment in in-person service sectors, retail, leisure and hospitality, ed and health, they collapsed in the beginning of the pandemic. Employment of other sectors surged, transportation, warehousing, professional services, so forth. If you look at occupational shifts based on different data sources, McKinsey estimates this to be 8.6 million for the 3 years since the pandemic, up to 2023. That's 50% more than pre-pandemic, the 3 years before. So a huge upheaval in the labor market, huge occupational shifts, and with that, then the surge in recruitment. Okay, now to just give you a graph from that McKinsey report that I just mentioned. The occupations that were hardest hit in terms of occupational shifts outward, food services, customer services and sales, office support, and so forth. Okay. And on the other hand, you have other sectors where there were much fewer occupational shifts outwards to other sectors. Now, you might think that this has to do primarily with labor demand falling in, say, some of the sectors where a lot of people move away because there's just no more jobs. But if that was the case, then wage growth in these sectors, such as food services, for instance, wouldn't have been growing strong. But this is exactly what happened. And so instead, a lot of these occupational shifts were driven by labor supply changes. Okay? And you can see this here when you look at first the blue line, just average hourly earnings over time in the United States have been growing at a much higher clip since the pandemic than prior to the pandemic. Forget about this initial spike here. This is just compositional change as the labor force temporarily changed within these different sectors. But overall, wages have been growing 22% since the pandemic started, and for food services, or I should say more generally, leisure and hospitality, it's been 30%. So very strong wage growth, which is great news generally for workers, but an issue overall, obviously, for employers who want to recruit people or retain people. Okay. Now, that's in nominal terms, right? These strong wage numbers. But we also know that we had a lot of inflation. So when you normalize by price growth, what we see then is that average hourly earnings in real terms, they have been growing strongly for leisure and hospitality. That's the red line. But overall, on average, wages are lower. Sorry, I shouldn't say lower. They have just recovered in real terms to about where we were before the pandemic. And for me, and this is sort of a side note here, it's not surprising that a lot of people in the economy, they don't feel so upbeat about current economic situation, despite what the current administration is trying to tell you. It's because wages have not been growing in real terms. Now, there is this subgroup, leisure and hospitality, because a lot of people moved out of these jobs towards other types of occupations, and that's clearly in the data, and it's hard to recruit there, if that's why wages are so. Okay. One last point, because the governor made a point about productivity. It's also interesting to look at average hourly earnings growth total relative to labor productivity in the US. When you look at that, and that's now the yellow line, and the blue line is just a lower frequency version of the line before that was blue. What's really striking is that labor productivity, aside from this swing here, right in the beginning of the pandemic, is on the same trend than what we had prior. So this is about a 1.5% growth, which is lower than what we had historically of labor productivity in the US. What's puzzling to me, and we don't have time to unpack this here, is why has real wage growth not kept up with this? Right? It's lower. Now you could say, well, it's because of corporate greed somehow. That's the labor share is lower, they keep more for themselves. I think it's more complicated than that. But I think this is a really interesting question. Why is it that labor productivity has been growing, whereas wages have not, despite all these troubles in recruitment? And obviously going forward, where is this gonna head? That's a really important question. So for my last few minutes or 2 minutes or so that I have, I want to talk briefly about the future, okay? Which is, where does artificial intelligence lead us? Are we gonna see a huge productivity growth that many people are mentioning, or is productivity gonna kind of keep on ticking up by 1.5% per year, as it has been over the last decade? Okay. So what's pretty clear, or what a lot of people think, is that a lot of occupations, they are exposed to AI, and it's gonna affect the majority of the US workforce, okay? Now, some people have argued that this will lead to explosive productivity. But other people, especially those who are actually trying to think hard about this within a sort of framework with that's a bit more organized, they're more skeptical. So Darren Nasser-Moglu is probably one of the foremost thinkers about how technology affects the labor market and productivity. He's arguing in recent work that the likely productivity growth will be, or boost will likely be modest. He's estimating something around 1% total over 10 years. That's 0.1% per year. So instead of 1.5% per year labor productivity growth, 1.6. Let's be generous, 1.7. That's not a big deal. It is a deal, obviously, but it's not that big of a deal. Okay. Now, of course, it's very difficult to forecast what's going to happen in the future, but I think that should give us a little bit of pause that everything is going to change dramatically over the next decade or so. Now, what is pretty clear, though, is that AI will replace some work, or automate some work, or parts of work, and will, on the other hand, enhance some of the work. Now, when you look into it, likely declining labor demand will occur for office support, for customer service. So that's where AI will substitute away some employment. On the other hand, you can see where AI may be a complement for STEM workers, creative, or business professionals. It could be the case. You know, I was thinking, where does education fit in, given that I'm a professor? I hope it's in the latter category, although I'm a little bit nervous, right, that they're going to be automated away, but who knows, right? We have a lot of conversations about that at Drexel, and obviously it's on many people's mind. But what's pretty clear, going again bigger picture, is that this is going to lead to a lot of occupational transitions. McKinsey thinks maybe 12 million by 2030, who knows? There's a large confidence bands about this, but I think it's going to lead again to a lot of job openings, a lot of recruiting, and huge competition for talent that is complementary with this new technology. Okay. Lastly, you know, what's going to be the overall picture of the? I think there it's always important to keep in mind that the technology can either automate away low-wage job, as it has done, say, with robots in the past, or it could also automate away relatively high-wage jobs, as it's predicted by some for AI. Now, where the balance is going to be important for wage equality. On top of that, you always have to take into account that when there is a new technology, it usually leads to new demand for labor in new areas. How quickly that will occur will then obviously have an effect on total wage growth and also the relative wage growth of different occupations. And how easily workers will move from low demand to high demand jobs is going to be really key. And from that point of view, I think policy has a really important role to play here. We don't want to have an overly regulated labor market. We want to allow workers to be easily moving from one profession to another. Degree requirements maybe are something that we should think seriously about, especially in the United States. We also want to think about how to invest in retraining and education. I don't know who mentioned it, but maybe, I guess it was you again. This first talk was really inspiring. That maybe this whole model of 20 years of education, the first 20 years, then 40 years of work, and then you sit at the sun in Florida is not something that is sustainable in the future. Maybe we need to have another educational part somewhere in our working lives. And the US is not really set up for this. That's a really big challenge. Similarly, I don't think in the US there is a strong culture of having apprenticeship programs as we have in certain European countries, for instance, but that make it easier to switch occupations and to become proficient in a new area. I think these are really important things to think about. And looking back for one more time, the US has had big labor market shocks in the past through trade, especially with China, and through automation. And I think the US was woefully unprepared to deal with those from the labor market side. And this is why we had such big wage inequality as a result. Hopefully, going forward, we can think about these things and invest in this so as to make AI something that is going to be profiting most of the workers. Thanks.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Diane, for the kind remarks and introduction. My name is Zach Stewart. I'm the Director of Talent Acquisition at Icon Clinical Research. A little bit about myself. So I've been with Icon for 11 years, and we've grown significantly in that time period from an organization that was 8,000 employees to now 45,000. So being in recruitment, it's been a busy time, and we've been able to see a lot of both organic and acquisition growth. We started as a 5-person team of scientists in Dublin, Ireland, and now we're a global organization spanning across many countries. I lead the Americas region for all of the hires that we make, both Latin America, US, and Canada. My responsibility includes both our executive level hirings all the way down to the interns that we hire. So for this year in 2024, we project that we'll do about 2,000 hires just in my team alone, and probably about 80% of that is in the US. You heard Andre and a lot of really intelligent economists speak today. I am not an economist. My background is a master's in business administration. I plan to hopefully add some context around the operations in the labor market and the supply, and also some trends that we're seeing. And it was interesting for me to hear about the challenges in recruitment, the day-to-day recruitment, because that's probably my day-to-day and what my team and I see every day. So hopefully I can add some context to that discussion. So I mentioned a little bit about Icon. We were recently just awarded Time's World's Best Company last year, 88th place on that list. So that was a big accomplishment for us, for an organization that's constantly hiring, and we hire individuals that are billable revenue. So there's a lot of pressure to hiring in our skill sets, and it is a very competitive market. So I hope to speak to a little bit of that competitiveness and how the macroeconomical factors have impacted us on more of an operational level. So there's 3 trends that I wanted to call out today that I thought would be interesting to the conversation that we were having today. The labor market in general, I think we are seeing less job openings, yet the labor market competition is still really high, despite slightly more available workers, which you heard a couple of points on today. There's less employment offers per search. So we're finding that a job seeker is putting out the same amount of time applying to a job, but getting less employment offers back, which I think is quite fascinating. So I'll share a couple of graphs on that. And then I think we've all been fascinated by the AI adoption or lack thereof in different aspects of different markets. So from a recruitment perspective on the corporation side, for a large employer like Icon, how are we using AI? I'm going to speak about what the most and what the least common ways that recruiters like myself and my team are using things like ChatGPT or other AI or Gen AI tools. So I thought this was an interesting graph to share. This is from Gartner's recent trading economics survey, which shows from the left to the right, different countries, US being on the left, the job openings to unemployed persons ratio per country. You'll see I think the important kind of points to make is you've got more workers that are available per jobs because job openings have dropped substantially since that peak in March 2022, especially in countries like the US. I think despite the uptick that we saw in the US between December of 2023 and January 2024, job openings are still 25% lower than they were at that peak. And I think across many economies, especially the US, we've observed historic lows in those unemployed people who are taking some different vacant jobs. It's probably important to note we're not seeing labor available per job rise due to unemployment. We're seeing unemployment in the US still at those historic lows. And somebody made a comment earlier that I agree with, the quit and the separation rates are at the pandemic levels that we saw in 2020. The research shows that we're proportionally fewer people working as the labor force participation rate has not reached that pre-pandemic labor or status. I think in line with the decline of job openings from the 2022 spike, candidates are receiving fewer offers, like I mentioned before. So you have candidates who are applying to roughly the same number of jobs, but are receiving fewer offers from that same effort. So I think that can tell you a couple different things. In Q4 of 2023, 53% of candidates received multiple offers compared to 72% at the beginning of the year. So a lot of factors that are playing into how individuals are seeking for jobs and how that's relating to the competitiveness and are you seeing a huge uptick in job applicants at the more competitive levels that's resulting in fewer offers? I think it's probably a little bit of all of those factors. In terms of how we're using AI in the recruitment world, this survey was the 2023 Gartner Recruiter Experience Survey. So it's asking a sample of over 300 recruiters how they're using generative AI in the workplace. And in their experience, how successful was it? So the most commonly used AI tool or way that we're using AI in the workplace is really more the admin type task, right? Writing job postings, some of those things where it's a little bit more functional. The labor market analysis, which was actually quite interesting, is not quite where we're seeing that use. So I think that could evolve over time. Generative AI, I think, could transform recruiting by streamlining the hiring process. There's a lot of ideas around bringing that into improving the candidate quality, enhancing the efficiency. I think we heard from the small business perspective that we want to offer a better experience, but we might not have the funds to do so. So trying to be creative and using AI to make it a more positive experience for candidates who are small to mid-sized employers, I think is definitely a trend we're continuing to see. But recruiting leaders like myself, we will continue to research to see how early adoption in AI will be something that we can utilize to be more effective in our operations. So I think just in summary, some of the trends that we expect is U.S. companies will remain competitive. It's an ultra competitive market right now for large organizations like Icon. We are seeing pay increases in the U.S. slowing, but the market expectation is still relatively high. U.S. companies' internal labor market barriers may cause attrition. I think there's that push-pull friction between employers and employees. Remote working and different aspects like that I think is creating a need to grow internally more I think that's something, a trend that we're seeing. And then further need for large employers to create that positive experience and really be giving that wow experience to candidates so that we continue to court candidates who have accepted offers. And we saw that great resignation in the last few years, the push-pull between candidates going back to their employer and getting a counter offer and then not going through with the offer that they accepted. Some of those trends are definitely still out there. And lastly, the continued trend of just identifying those non-monetary incentives, such as flexible work. I think a lot of companies are offering more generous PTO structures, manageable workloads, things that small or mid-sized organizations can do on top of just giving the wage and leading with wages to attract talent when increasing that wage is not an option. So in summary, I think we're seeing a lot of trends as a result of macroeconomical level, and yeah, hopefully that was helpful to share today. So thank you.
Andre, Zach, thank you so much. Great perspectives on the labor market and a great way to put sort of a cherry on top of this whole day's worth of topics. Let me start by saying, you know, all roads lead to monetary policy. And President Parker echoed what Chair Powell said last week in his prepared remarks, which is that within the labor market, supply and demand are coming back into better balance. Now, if you're Holly speaking on behalf of small businesses, you probably don't agree with that. If you're Dana speaking on behalf of larger companies, you might agree with that. I'm just curious, maybe we can start with you, Andre. Do you agree with that statement that the labor market is coming back, the supply and demand imbalance is coming back into better position? Based on the data, or the macro data, certainly, there's a lot of indicators that say that what we've seen immediately after the pandemic, red hot labor market has normalized a bit. But I also think that, you know, relative to historical data, say a few years before the pandemic, we're still in a market of really high demand relative to supply. We shouldn't forget that 2019 was a red hot labor market. So when we compare what we are right now to that, it's still very competitive market. I certainly think for small businesses. Zach, your boots on the ground. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it remains ultra competitive for the skilled labor out there. The more competitive, naturally competitive markets like life sciences, which I'm in. Talking to a lot of colleagues in the IT or the financial services, I think that remains pretty steady. I think it's ultra competitive. There is a lot of push-pull between employers and employees, like I mentioned before, that I think cause some funny trends in the market in terms of going to different locations, or you see some going to different industries, but I think it will remain ultra.
And if the Fed's target for unemployment is 4%, and coincidentally, that is actually where our unemployment rate is, and President Parker talked about, you really need to see some risks to the labor market to cause them to cut aggressively. What's your take on that concept of the unemployment rate? Maybe it's really ties into the question I just asked, but I'm just curious, do we see those risks that would really cause the Fed? Because he talked about how the labor market moves in a non-linear fashion, and what might be, if you could think of a risk that would cause the unemployment rate to shoot up or labor market to deteriorate, what might that be? And Zach, you can start, but Andre, maybe pull in the immigration concept as well. Maybe after November, we'll know better.
I think every industry is unique. In the life sciences industry, I think we're always going to be driven by how many, compounds or trials or, what the pipeline is of the life sciences industry. So I don't see it affecting us too much in that way, because I think it's always flowing in the natural way that the demand is there. But maybe I can hand it over to you.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna start with the immigration part. I think, whoever is president, the US just has a real issue with its immigration policy, right? Both on the low end and at the high end. A lot of people want to come to the US. It's a land of opportunity. And you make it incredibly difficult. And I think that's an issue. I'm not saying there should be some open border or something like that. We should have a system that actually works. People can apply and then they get within a reasonable amount of time a work permit because all the companies. So that's my first point. The other point about monetary policy is, I think what President Harker is really hoping for is that, there's not some really nasty supply shock, because that would be a situation which unemployment will go up, prices potentially also go up, and then they really have to choose. Right? I think the Fed is still, has still a very high credibility, but at the end of the day, the inflation target is 2%. And I think markets are watching whether you're gonna go back down to that at some point. It's not 3.5, it's 2. And if they say at some point it's gonna be 3.5, then it's gonna be a real problem. And so we really, I think what's really the bad situation is if we had some, 70s style negative supply shock where it's just a dilemma. Well, I know this is a group that loves to ask questions, so why don't I open it up, see what's on your minds. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have a sense or from the data or from surveys of what the expectation is for a worker who wants to work remote for an industry where that's possible? So if not leisure hospitality, not running a lab where you have to be there every day. If you were looking at the average job offer, would that be 3 days a week or 4 days a week in person? Is there an industry standard or is it still very varied?
That's definitely.
Yeah. We've done a lot of analysis within Icon, and I think a lot of large companies are analyzing what their strategy is going to be in order to both compete for the talent that wants the flexibility, but also have people where we need them, right? So we hire for scientists in our lab in Whitesboro, New York. They're bioanalytical scientists. They always have to be there, right? But if we're hiring a financial accountant or a support role, legal attorney, maybe they allow that flexibility. So I don't have any percentages or anything that I can quote, but I think more companies are doing that. More companies are trying to think about it without a broad sweeping policy, but do what's right for the employees and also go with the trend of, do we really need them there or can we offer some flexibility? So I've seen a lot of that, speaking to a lot of colleagues and other leaders across the industries. I think you'll continue to see that.
Sure.
Yeah, I've got a question for question for Andre. Do you think that these sectors of the labor market that are experiencing the most rapid growth, such as government and healthcare, do you think that they are less sensitive to interest rates than housing, automobiles, and much larger than those industries? And if so, how does that impact the Fed's ability to alter labor market conditions via interest rates? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think it's definitely yes, they're less sensitive. It's making it harder for the Fed to stimulate demand in that sense. And I think it's been a bit of a surprise if you look at the last 2 years, how resilient the US economy was to interest rates overall. And maybe it's partly because some sectors, they just don't react as much. Sure.
I'm among those who are worried about AI and higher ed, as I work at Temple University. One of the challenges I feel that educators struggle with is if a student is studying with us for between 4 and 6 years, and the market's completely different when they graduate compared to when they entered, how are we to prepare them? So I'm wondering what skills you both see
as somewhat AI proof or somewhat future proof that would benefit educators to be emphasizing so that our students, when they graduate, are still marketable and still relevant. And I know this is a tough one, because our crystal balls are cloudy lately.
Why don't you start?
Well, yeah, I think, you see a lot of trends on, learning skills and growing skills and, whether that's a bachelor's degree or, something concrete, I think AI is just going to be part of that, right? I think there's always gonna have to be a willingness to adopt at a certain level, in order to be efficient and to retain the human, element, but also to leverage the technology. So I don't know exactly, which ones could be,
AI group.
yeah, AI groups. But yeah, I think it's probably like a combination of, incorporating them into the general skills and trades that we already see.
I tell my students that economics is obviously a really good field to be in. We tend to ask critical questions, right? Our reputation is that we kind of talk and say so give each other a hard time, but really what I think this is a reflection of us asking, good questions. And so if I think about, and again, the crystal ball is cloudy, if I think about what is going to be a valuable skill to have when you have AI is how to ask critical questions, how to think outside of the box, and how to then work with AI to come up with better answers more quickly. And so I think, some fields, they will have a harder time to implement that than others. So that's all I'm gonna say, because I'm not much more intelligent.
You both did a good job of talking about how AI can be a substitute, but more so it's probably a complement. And like any industry that goes through changes, AI, at the end of the day, will hopefully make us better, including the students that survives through that. But I like the concept of it being complementary to the labor market.
But I want to add something to this. So even if it's complementary, right? At the end of the day, it depends on how much demand there is for a certain type of work. So imagine, I don't want to get into this fallacy of there's a lump of labor available, right? But if there's a certain amount of computer programming that has to be done, then the computer programmer is in and of itself complementary with AI, then of course you need less computer programmers because the ones who remain, they will just get the work done faster. So that's why it's not clear whether STEM is necessarily going to be a winner of it for in the new AI environment. It could be if the demand for STEM related work is going to go up enough. But I think that's where it becomes really difficult.
All right, folks, you heard it here first. Creative destruction, I think, is will end. Thank you all so much. Oh, Bill, did you want to say something?
I have a question for Zach. As a global company, is there a country in the world that is easier to find staff to confirm than others?
Oh, that's a great question. I think depending on the skill sets, right? We're growing, I'm growing a team right now in Mexico City. And it's kind of an evolving market, right? So there might not be that skilled clinical research project manager that we're looking for, but in other more established countries like the US, they will be there. So you probably measure easy to hire based on cost and speed. Depending on the skill set, to answer your question, I think there could be an easier market if you're looking for IT in a certain, in India or wherever, that could be easier. But I think it's evolving quite quickly.
And since Bill's the founder of the Irish American Business Chamber Network, I think the answer was Ireland.
I will say,
right?
I was just in Dublin in December, and yeah, it's our corporate headquarters, and yeah, it's a great location for us. We have no trouble finding talent though.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you to the great panel and thank all of you for your participation as we conclude the conference. I think it's fair to say that we got a commitment on behalf of the Governor Makhlouf that ECB is gonna cut another 3 times. And at the same time, from President Harker, there is a possibility for 4 cuts. Well, seriously, it was a great kind of conference. I thank you, the 42nd conference, really. It was a great success, thanks to the governor that came from far away, from across the pond. And thanks to Governor Harker, but at the same time, I'm very thankful to all the presenters and the individuals that have contributed to the success of this conference. I can say that special thanks to Bill McLaughlin for his initiative with the Irish American Chamber of Commerce, for his commitment to GIC. I want to thank especially Molly because she got committed to this program and worked with me, tolerated me for quite some time. Special thanks to Jill and of course Sandra is here. And I would like to invite all of you to attend the 43rd annual conference that will take place next year, to be announced in terms of place and time. Thank you.
We're going to finish. Yes, I feel like so.